Imagine a civilization so obsessed with order that it numbered its dreams. Every soldier cataloged, every helmet etched with a unit mark, every stone signed like a bureaucrat's whisper, property of Rome. The empire that stretched from the sunlit pillars of Spain to the misty edges of Britain didn't just conquer land, it conquered paperwork. Roman administrators tracked everything: births, deaths, grain shipments, even the number of nails issued to the army's carpenters. To be Roman was to be recorded, and yet somewhere in that ocean of wax tablets and bronze plaques, entire legions vanish. No farewell, no note, no imperial decree, just gone. That's not supposed to happen. This was the ancient world's greatest machine, an empire that ran on ink and discipline. A single missing soldier could trigger a chain of memos. But here, we're talking about thousands of men, 5,000 Roman citizens, trained killers, engineers, priests, cooks, doctors, all moving as one iron organism swallowed whole by history. How does a ghost like that form? The records call them legiones amici, the lost legions. They flicker into existence in one decade's inscriptions, only to vanish by the next. Most of the time, the gaps are small enough that historians can shrug. Paper rots. Clerks die. Empires lose track of their own shadow. But sometimes, the hole in history is so wide, you can hear the wind through it. Of all these disappearances, one stands taller than the rest, not because it's the bloodiest, but because it feels personal. The Ninth Legion, the Legio 9 Hispana. They were Rome's veterans, Caesar's wolves, hardened in the forests of Gaul, survivors of civil war builders, of roads, walls, and cities. And one day, after more than a century of service, they walked north into the mists of Britain and never came back. The bureaucracy that never forgot them. It's the sort of mystery that keeps historians pacing the floor at night. Because Rome was meticulous. Every legion carried its own tabularium, an archive of roles, promotions, and punishments. Promotions required paperwork. Discharges required paperwork. Even losing a sandal probably required paperwork. So when the ninth disappears, no discharge diplomas, no letters home, not even a single officer's tombstone after 108 AD. It's as if the empire itself flinched and looked away. Maybe that's the real horror of it. Rome could accept defeat. It had lost battles before Cannae Tudeberg Carre. But this is different. There's no battlefield, no heroic last stand to carve into marble. Just silence. And silence in Rome was suspicious. Somewhere in a forgotten valley, maybe there were shields buried in peat, their red paint turned to brown. Somewhere, a standard bearer still clutched the eagle, refusing to let it fall. Somewhere, the paperwork was never filed. When modern archaeologists dig through the ruins of Roman forts, the kind with perfect right angles and drainage ditches that would make any engineer weep with pride, they sometimes find tablets written by anonymous soldiers, notes about Boots' beer girlfriends. But never from the ninth. Their absence has weight. It's not just a missing page in a book. It's like a breath the empire took and never exhaled. The historian Tacitus once said that the secret of empire is to forget. Maybe he didn't mean it literally. But in this case, forgetting became an art form. As you picture Rome at its height, marble gleaming in the sun, senators murmuring beneath frescoed ceilings, legions marching like red rivers down stone roads. Remember that beneath all that order was chaos carefully hidden under seals and signatures. The empire that remembered everything still had blind spots big enough to swallow a legion. And the story of one such disappearance, the most famous of them all, begins not with loss, but with creation. With the sound of hammers striking bronze in a dusty camp on the Italian plain. Because before the ninth vanished into fog, it had already lived through a century of glory, terror, and transformation. It began as an experiment, Rome's first taste of a professional army. Soldiers who swore not to a city, but to a man. Julius Caesar. Their story starts there in the smoke of the late Republic, when ambition was more dangerous than any enemy. Before the fog of Britain, there was the dust of Gaul. Before the silence, there was thunder, and that's where we march next. If you were a Roman soldier, your soul wasn't your own. It belonged to the Aquila, the golden eagle that marched before you. It glittered at the heart of every legion, a winged god of empire nailed to a pole of oak. When you swore your oath sacramentum militia, you didn't just pledge obedience to Rome. You promised your blood to that bird. Every legion had one. Only one. Lose the eagle, and the legion's spirit was dead, no matter how many soldiers survived. It wasn't just a military symbol. It was a heartbeat cast in gold. The man who carried it, the Aquilifer, was as sacred as the standard itself. He marched bareheaded, because no helmet could shield you from the gods. And he was usually the first to die. To drop the eagle was to disgrace generations. To recover it could make you immortal. And so Rome's armies became paper armies, cataloged down to the last shield strap. Behind the shining heroics of marble statues, an entire world of bureaucrats and clerks kept the war machine alive. The army was a living spreadsheet. Each legion, about 5,000 men, divided into 10 cohorts, then into centuries, then into contubernia, of 8 men sharing one tent, one pot of stew, one sense of misery. Each group had its roles, pay records, supply lists, and disciplinary logs. It was organized with a precision modern accountants might envy and modern soldiers might fear. The empire issued bronze diplomata to retiring veterans, meticulously listing service dates, commanders, and privileges earned. These weren't sentimental mementos. They were bureaucratic armor proof that the state owed you a farm and a pension instead of a spear in the back. Inscriptions marked everything, from fort gates to tombstones, all proudly naming the legion that built, bled, or died there. That's what makes the story of the lost legions so eerie, because they weren't supposed to be losable. The Teutoburg Forest proved it once in blood. 3 entire legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, walked into the German woods in 9 AD and never walked out. Arminius, their former ally turned enemy, led the ambush. It rained for 3 days. The Romans couldn't even lift their shields, too slippery, too heavy. Men drowned in mud. Horses screamed. The forest swallowed them like an animal closing its jaws. When word reached Rome, Emperor Augustus tore his robes and struck his head against the walls of his palace, crying, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The numbers, 17, 18, and 19, were never used again. Rome had no funeral for its ghosts, but it knew how to bury memory. That was the empire's paradox, obsessed with control, terrified of what it couldn't catalog. A lost legion wasn't just a military failure. It was a spiritual glitch in the empire's self-image. Rome didn't just lose soldiers. It lost a piece of its own reflection. So when centuries later, another legion, the 9th Hispana, faded into silence, it struck a familiar but even more disquieting chord. Because this time, there was no forest of betrayal, no disaster to mourn, no Arminius, no battlefield, just a quiet fading. Imagine the clerks in Rome's military archives, the ones hunched over parchment copying reports by lamplight. One day, a unit they'd logged for decades simply stopped sending returns. No record of disbandment, no disaster report, no explanation at all. Some future historian flips through the tablets and finds nothing. Just a gap between the last line of ink and the next. That's the bureaucratic version of death. Not a sword through the chest, but a blank space where a name should be. The 9th Hispana wasn't the first to disappear. but it would become the most famous, precisely because it left no ruins. Only a question. The same question that still haunts archaeologists in muddy trenches across northern Britain. What happened to the legion that Rome forgot to remember? But before we can lose them, we have to know them. Before they marched into the mist, they marched through history, through Caesar's Gaul, Pompey's war, Augustus's reforms, and Claudius's invasion of Britain. They were the empire's veterans, its architects, its survivors. And like all Roman stories, theirs began with ambition and a general who thought he could outsmart the Senate. Before the Ninth's legend turned to mist, the idea of lost legions already haunted Rome's imagination. The empire that prided itself on never forgetting its soldiers had already been forced to bury 3 entire legions without graves, and their ghosts still whispered through every campfire story, from the Rhine to the Euphrates. It began in 9 AD, in a place so wet and endless, the Romans simply called it the forest. To them, Germania was a map full of green ink and bad omens. The air smelled of pine and peat, and the kind of silence that waits before an ambush. Publius Quinctilius Varus, the imperial governor, led 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, along narrow forest trails under gray skies. They trusted a local prince named Arminius, Rome's golden ally, educated in Latin, armored like them, loyal. Or so they believed. Then the forest moved. Spears came from every direction, from behind mossy trunks, from above the ridges, from beneath the ferns. The rain thickened into a roar. Mules panicked, wagons overturned, and the Roman columns stretched for miles could not form their precious battle lines. Varus's lieutenants shouted orders that vanished in the wind. Soldiers hacked at invisible enemies. Officers slipped in the mud. The eagle standards, the hearts of their legions, gleamed briefly, then disappeared into the chaos. For 3 days, the storm and the forest conspired to erase them. And when it was done, nothing was left but trampled mud and silence. When the news reached Rome, Augustus himself broke. He tore his robes, refused food, and wandered the palace shouting, "Varus, give me back my legions," as if names could summon ghosts. And that was when Rome began its strange superstition. The numbers, 7 acetate, and 19, were retired forever. Never again would those numerals march beneath an eagle. To the Romans, a number could be cursed just like a battlefield. It's a detail historians often overlook, that this was not mere bureaucracy, but trauma. Rome's efficiency, its ledger-like logic, cracked that day. Losing a legion wasn't just a military disaster, it was a psychic one. Imagine if the United States retired the number 93 for airplanes after one vanished. That's how Rome coped. The eagles themselves became relics of grief. The emperor sent armies again and again into Germania, just to retrieve them, not to avenge the dead, but to reclaim the gold birds that symbolized Rome's soul. When Germanicus finally recovered 2 of the 3 eagles, he staged ceremonies like funerals, as if the medal itself could absolve the loss of 20,000 lives. So by the time the 9th Hispana appeared on the rolls, the empire had already learned how to deal with vanishing. On paper, anyway. That's the strange poetry of Roman administration. Everything looks permanent until it isn't. One day, your legion's name is carved into marble. The next, your number is avoided like a curse. And yet the machine kept turning. New recruits kept swearing the oath. New forts rose from riverbanks. Scribal hands copied the same words, in the same order, Legio nam Hispana, present loyal operational. None of them could imagine that one day their own ink would fade into the same silence that swallowed Varus's men. Rome's legions were its memory. When one disappeared, it was as if a part of the empire's mind went blank. But history has a dark sense of humor. Sometimes the empire forgot its soldiers. Sometimes its soldiers remembered too much. The ghosts of Teutoburg marched with every new recruit. Don't lose the eagle veterans warned half in jest, half in superstition. The ninth Hispana would carry that warning for generations, a golden bird gleaming above their ranks as they crossed rivers and continents from Gaul to Spain to the misty ends of the earth. They were born in the age of ambition, under a man who thought himself larger than the Republic. The forests of Germany had shown Rome what forgetting felt like. Now, Julius Caesar was about to show it what ambition cost. And in the dust of Gaul beneath his banners, the Ninth Legion would earn its name. Somewhere in the 80s BC, when the Roman Republic was choking on its own ambition, a new legion was raised, one among many born out of civil war political chaos, and the quiet genius of an idea, a professional army. Before then, soldiers were farmers. They fought in summer, harvested in autumn, and returned to their olive groves when the Senate said the season was done. Rome's enemies had learned to wait until winter, but then came Gaius Marius the general, who decided the state needed soldiers who didn't go home. He opened the ranks to the poor, gave them armor pay, and most dangerously, loyalty. Not to the Republic, to him. From that moment, Rome's armies stopped being citizen militias and became something else, entirely extensions of their commander's ambition. They weren't fighting for the Senate or for abstract ideals of virtue. They fought for land loot and the man whose name they chanted when they marched. And few names echoed louder than Julius Caesar. By the time Caesar raised the Ninth Legion, the Republic was already crumbling under the weight of its own bureaucracy and ego. Senators schemed, generals bribed, and the streets of Rome were rivers of rumor. Soldiers were currency, and Caesar was a man very rich in soldiers. He found his recruits in the hills of central Italy, lean, hard men used to carrying more than their share of weight. Their dialects varied, their dreams did not. Service meant pay. Pay meant citizenship for those not yet citizens, and a small piece of land if you lived long enough to retire. The recruiters, delectors, moved from town to town with scrolls and scales measuring height, chest, and teeth. You couldn't be flat-footed. You couldn't be too short. Scars were good. Missing fingers, not so much. A doctor would inspect you like livestock. And if you passed, you placed your hand on the legion's eagle and swore the sacramentum, I swear to obey the orders of my commanders and never to desert the standards. That was it. You were no longer a man. You were a number in a century, a gear in Rome's machine. Caesar's new Ninth Legion, soon to be known as the Hispana, though that name would come later, was one of several forged for his coming campaign in Gaul. The official reason was noble protect Roman allies from migrating tribes. The unofficial reason Caesar needed war to pay for politics. Conquest meant plunder. Plunder meant power. The legion numbered about 5,000 men, the size of a small town, armed and alphabetized. 10 cohorts each, led by centurions who measured rank by the scars on their faces. Each cohort divided into centuries, each century into contubernia, 8 men to a tent. 8 strangers sharing one blanket, one fire, one fate. Training began the moment they swore the oath. The instructors were brutal veterans of older wars, who had survived long enough to lose faith in luck. Recruits practiced with wooden swords, twice as heavy as the real ones, hacking at posts until their hands bled. They learned to thrust, not slash, a Roman lesson in efficiency. Wounds are cheap. Kills are permanent. Marching came next. 20 miles a day, full kit armor weapons, ration steaks for the camp palisade, plus a few cooking pots and bad jokes. A legion's nickname for its soldiers was Marius mules, beasts of burden, that laughed, cursed, and built empires, one blister at a time. Then came formation drills, testudo, the famous tortoise. Shields locked above and in front, turning 1,000 men into one armored animal that advanced step by step through a hail of arrows. The recruits cursed it, fainted under it, got up again. And slowly, they became Romans, not by birth, but by discipline. The pay was steady 9 sesterces a day, though much of it vanished into deductions for food armor, maintenance, and the occasional bribe to your centurion. But the promise of loot citizenship and the right to walk home in old age, wearing the toga of a veteran, made the mud taste sweeter. When Caesar was appointed governor of Gaul in 59 BC, the 9th marched north with him. Their destination was a mystery called Gallia, a patchwork of tribes, rivers, and forests that no Roman map could quite agree on. To the recruits, it might as well have been the edge of the world. They learned quickly that Caesar's version of war was methodical. He built camps with geometric precision, a fortress every night, ditches and ramparts measured by the same pattern, whether on a hill or swamp. The 9th cut trees, dug trenches, laid stone, and watched Caesar's engineers shape the wilderness into something legible Roman theirs. And they fought, not for marble ideals, but for survival, for plunder, and for the strange pride of men who knew they were part of something that would outlive them. The Gallic tribes fought differently. Wild charges, bright shields, the roar of horns echoing through fog. The Romans didn't roar. They advanced in silence, shields locked, eyes forward, until the enemy broke on them like surf against a seawall. At night, when the campfires burned low, you could hear the hammering from the blacksmith tents, pilum heads being reforged armor, patch the heartbeat of the legion in iron and smoke. Caesar's campaigns would turn into legend and propaganda, but for the men of the 9th, they were simply years of mud exhaustion and the smell of wet leather. They built siege ramps higher than city walls, starved in trenches, froze in alpine passes. They learned that courage wasn't a shout, it was endurance. The legion's early battles against the Helvetii, the Belgae, the Nervii toughened them into veterans. By the time Caesar faced Vercingetorix at Alesia, the 9th were professionals. They could dig a trench faster than most men could make breakfast. Their discipline was terrifying in its beauty. At Alesia, while Gallic warriors screamed from the hilltops, the 9th built double walls, one facing in, one facing out, encircling both the besieged city and the army trying to rescue it. It was genius born from exhaustion. And when the final assault came, the 9th held. Caesar rewarded them with praise spoils and the knowledge that they were now part of something immortal. In the Roman mind, the army was the empire, and the 9th was its beating heart. When the Gallic Wars ended, Caesar crossed another line, this time the Rubicon. The 9th crossed with him. Their loyalty wasn't to the Senate, or the Republic, or even the gods. It was to their general. The oath they'd sworn had transformed from words to faith. As they marched toward the civil war that would shatter Rome, veterans of the 9th might have remembered the ghosts of the legions lost in Teutoburg. The superstition that a legion could vanish its number retired its story cut from the rolls. But for now, they were alive, their eagle gleaming in the torchlight, their names still written in the empire's ledgers. They didn't know it yet, but one day, their own number 9 would become another ghost on Rome's roll. The year was 58 BC, and the world smelled of rain and ambition. Julius Caesar, newly appointed governor of Gaul, stood at the edge of empire and saw opportunity disguised as wilderness. To him, the forests and rivers of the north weren't boundaries, they were ledgers waiting to be filled. Conquest for Caesar was paperwork written in blood. Behind him, the 9th Legion waited. Their boots were already caked in the mud of Italy, their bronze glinting under a pale sky. Some of them were farm boys who still dreamed of vineyards and wives. Others were veterans who knew better, that glory came with a price paid in blisters, not laurels. Their first true test came swiftly. The Helvetii, a migrating tribe from modern Switzerland, were on the move, hundreds of thousands of people, wagons, animals, fire, and chaos spilling toward Roman territory. To the Senate, it looked like invasion. To Caesar, it looked like a reason to write his name into eternity. He marched north with 4 legions, the 7th, 8th, 10th, and the 9th Hispana. Together, they crossed rivers, chopped down forests, and built bridges so fast it seemed the earth itself obeyed them. The 9th earned their first scars that summer, facing warriors who fought not for gold, but for home. The Helvetii charged like thunder-painted bodies, screaming faces, long swords flashing under the sun, but the Romans didn't scream. They moved as one. A wall of shields, a pulse of metal and muscle. The air filled with the snap of Pila Roman javelins, and then with silence. When the dust cleared, the field was theirs. The dead lay in rows that looked almost organized, the grim symmetry Rome so loved. Caesar, watching from horseback, wrote it all down later in his calm, bureaucratic Latin. The Helvetii were routed. No poetry, no pity. But for the men of the 9th, that sentence meant something very different. It meant the smell of blood and wet grass, the sting of sweat in their eyes, and the cold realization that war was a business they now belonged to. The campaign didn't stop there. Gaul was vast, and every tribe seemed to speak with both sword and promise. The Belgae rose next, and the 9th marched again, their sandals slapping against the new roads they themselves had built. They fought in forests so dense that sunlight was a rumor among rivers that swallowed armor whole. Caesar's legions became machines. By day they fought. By night they built. Every evening, wherever they stopped, a fortress rose from the dirt trenches, ramparts, palisades, the same perfect shape every time. It was a kind of prayer, order imposed on chaos. The 9th learned that a Roman camp wasn't just protection, it was ideology in timber. Rome could recreate itself anywhere. When the Nervii ambushed Caesar's army near the Sambre River, the 9th found themselves nearly crushed. The Nervii fought like men possessed, throwing themselves against the Roman line even as their families cheered from the hills. The Romans pinned, and bleeding barely held the line. Caesar himself grabbed a shield and joined the front, rallying his men with curses and promises. The 9th closed ranks and ground forward inch by inch until the forest floor was a swamp of bodies. Afterward, Caesar again wrote the same cold summary. Of all the Gauls, the Nervii are the most warlike. He didn't mention the hundreds of legionaries who would never march again. But that was how the 9th learned what it meant to be Caesar's soldiers. Not just fighters, witnesses, builders of empire and grave diggers of its enemies. The years bled together. The 9th crossed the Rhine on a bridge Caesar ordered, built just to prove it could be done. He wanted the Germanic tribes to know that not even their rivers could stop him. The 9th helped build it in 10 days, 10, and then watched as their general rode across it, like a god, only to burn it afterward, as if to say, "We came, because we wanted to." They fought the Suebi in the east, the Veneti in the west, the Eburones in the north, a carousel of tribes' names and deaths that blurred into legend. Every campaign taught the same lesson: Rome didn't retreat. It reorganized. For the soldiers, life became ritual. Every day began with the trumpet, the sound slicing through fog. Bread, salt, pork, a gulp of wine. Inspection, march, build, fight, build again. The rhythm of an empire breathing. And through it all, the 9th changed. They became something more than men from Italy, a brotherhood of survivors. They carved dice from bone, carved gods into their shields, and tattooed scars into stories. They joked that their general was writing their obituaries in advance, one campaign at a time. By the time Vercingetorix, the great Gallic chieftain, united the tribes against Rome, the Ninth were veterans hardened beyond fear. They'd learned that Caesar's greatest weapon wasn't his army, it was time. He moved faster than anyone believed possible, striking building and vanishing again before the enemy could breathe. The siege of Alesia in 52 BC became their masterpiece. A city on a hill, surrounded by 80,000 Gallic warriors, protected by walls and pride. Caesar ordered something mad, not a direct assault, but 2 rings of fortifications, one to trap the enemy inside another, to keep reinforcements out. The Ninth dug, hauled, and built like demons. For miles around, the landscape turned Roman ditches, stakes, towers, ramparts, 11 miles of inner wall, 13 of outer. You could see the geometry of conquest from the sky. When the relief army arrived, perhaps 250,000 strong, the Romans were trapped between 2 storms. Thunder outside, desperation inside. The Ninth manned the northern sector, facing waves of charging Gauls under the summer sun. The noise was unbearable: horns, war cries, clashing iron, until Caesar sent in his reserves and the tide broke. By nightfall, Alesia fell. Vercingetorix surrendered his sword at Caesar's feet, and among the silent ranks behind their general stood the Ninth Hispana, caked in blood, unblinking, victorious. Their reward: a few coins, a share of loot, and the knowledge that they had changed history, or at least given their general enough material to change it for them. When Caesar returned to Rome, he returned as a hero. The Ninth marched in his triumph. Their armor polished, their faces stern. They had been his wolves, in Gaul, disciplined, merciless, efficient. The Senate cheered him, but it also feared him, because an army that loved its general more than its government was an army that could make or unmake Rome itself. And soon they would prove it. The veterans of the Ninth men, who had survived a decade of Caesar's wars, were about to face their greatest enemy yet. Not the wild tribes of Gaul, not even the disciplined phalanxes of the East, but Romans, their own brothers in arms. When Caesar reached the banks of the Rubicon and uttered the words that would doom the Republic, Alea Iacta, the Ninth crossed with him. The die was cast. The wolf pack had chosen its master over its senate, and from that river onward, their destiny would forever be tied to his. They didn't know it, but their march north through the mud and chaos of Gaul had been the rehearsal. The real storm was waiting across the sea decades later on an island Rome barely believed existed: Britain. For now, the Ninth were heroes, but history, like Rome itself, never let heroes rest for long. It is January of 49 BC. Northern Italy lies under sheets of rain rivers, swollen and brown. A legion's boots drum against the mud as they march south, red cloaks snapping in the wind. At their head rides a man who does not look back. Julius Caesar has just committed treason, and the Ninth Legion, his oldest and most loyal, has followed him into it without hesitation. Crossing the Rubicon was more than a military move. It was sacrilege, a declaration that the law of Rome itself no longer applied. The river was narrow, unremarkable, yet on its southern bank began the territory that no general was permitted to enter with an army. Every soldier knew this. Every man understood that stepping across meant war against their own countrymen. Still they marched. The men of the Ninth had followed Caesar through 10 years of storms, swamps, and forests. They had watched him lead from the front, seen him bleed beside them, and heard him promise that their service would not be forgotten. They didn't fight for the Senate's marble ideals. They fought for the man whose name could silence fear. Behind them, the Republic crumbled. Pompey, the great Caesar's one-time ally, and now rival, gathered his forces in Greece, backed by the Senate and most of Rome's nobility. It was brother against brother, veteran against veteran, the last gasp of an old world trying to resist the new. The ninth moved quickly. Caesar was always a master of speed, the kind of commander who believed that a week's march done in 4 days could win a war before it began. Town after town opened its gates to him, not out of love, but out of exhaustion. People understood what the ninth represented inevitability. The first great clash came at Dyrrhachium on the Adriatic coast, modern Albania. Pompey held the heights. Caesar's forces, including the ninth, held the hunger. The siege dragged on for weeks under the merciless sun. Supply ships failed to reach the shore, and the soldiers learned the taste of boiled leather and salt water. Then Pompey struck. It began at dawn, arrows blackening the sky horns, echoing from the cliffs. The ninth, holding the southern lines, fought like beasts, forming the tight shield walls they had perfected in Gaul. They held until their pila splintered and their arms went numb. When the line finally buckled, Caesar himself rode among them shouting, "Turn, and it will be victory." They turned. They fought. And for one brief moment, it looked as if they might break through. But the numbers were too great and the position hopeless. The ninth bled the enemy and withdrew in order not chaos the difference between a retreat and a rout. Caesar lost the field, but not his army. His genius was knowing when defeat was only a detour. He regrouped, refitted, and led his men inland toward Thessaly, toward the open plains of Pharsalus. It was there, in August of 48 BC, that Rome devoured itself. Picture it morning fog, over a dry riverbed, two vast armies facing each other across the plain. Caesar commanded roughly 22,000 men, Pompey nearly twice that number. The ninth held a place of honor on Caesar's right flank, veterans whose mere presence steadied younger troops. The horns sounded. The ground began to tremble. Arrows hissed overhead, and the air filled with the thunder of sandals and shields. The ninth advanced at a measured pace, their line as straight as a ruler. Across from them came the sound of thousands shouting the same word, Pompeius. The first collision of the two lines was like two continents meeting. Spears shattered, shields rang, and men vanished beneath the press of bodies. Dust rose so thick it turned daylight to twilight. And through it, the ninth held pushing, killing, advancing. Pompey's cavalry meant to sweep the flanks broke under Caesar's hidden reserves. Within hours, the larger army was collapsing in confusion. Caesar, dusty and smiling, rode among his men, shouting the simplest of praises, "Good ninth, good." By midday it was over. Pharsalus belonged to Caesar. Pompey fled to Egypt and would soon die there, decapitated on the beach, his once glorious head offered to a horrified Caesar as a gift. The ninth, for their loyalty, were rewarded with pride and more marching. They had followed Caesar from Gaul to Greece, through starvation and slaughter, and emerged undefeated in his eyes. But victory, as always, came with exhaustion. The men wanted land peace and time to grow old. Caesar, however, had larger dreams. He moved the ninth through campaigns in Africa and Spain, stamping out the last embers of the Republic's resistance. By 45 BC, they had fought in so many battles that their banners looked like relics from another age. Then came the unthinkable. On the Ides of March 44th, BC Caesar fell to the knives of senators who mistook assassination for restoration. The news reached the legions like thunder rolling down the roads. Some wept, others cursed Rome. The ninth, stationed far from the city, waited for orders that would never come. Their general was gone, and with him, the world they had built. The power vacuum that followed made the Civil War look almost civilized by comparison. The Republic's corpse was carved by rival claimants, Mark Antony, Octavian Lepidus, each claiming Caesar's mantle. The legions swore new oaths, old loyalties eroded, and once again, the Ninth found themselves under new command. When Octavian finally emerged as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, the legions were reshaped, professionalized, and settled into a new order. The Ninth, scarred and reduced, were among those reconstituted for the empire's new frontier duties. They were granted the cognomen Hispana, after their campaigns in Spain, the Spanish Legion. Their identity evolved, but their spirit didn't. They remained Caesar's wolves, pragmatic, enduring proud. In the years that followed, they served under emperors who never once rode with them into battle. They built roads through Gaul-tamed rebellions in Pannonia and guarded the Rhine against the restless tribes beyond. When the Teutoburg disaster struck decades later, the Ninth heard of it with a soldier's superstition, a grim reminder that even legions could die. The men of the Ninth had become old hands at survival. They knew how to build a fort before breakfast, how to make wine from spoiled grapes, how to turn a spear shaft into a tent pole if need be. Their humor was black, their songs obscene, and their loyalty still was to each other more than to any emperor. They had outlived Caesar Pompey and the Republic. They had fought for every idea Rome had ever claimed to believe in, and for every lie it told itself. When they finally sailed west under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, their numbers renewed, but their spirit ancient. They were no longer young men from Italy. They were a myth that marched. Their orders were simple: invade the island beyond the mist. To most Romans, Britannia was a rumor, a place of rain iron and barbarians with blue-painted skin. To the Ninth, it was just another horizon, another map waiting to be drawn in trenches and blood. They could not know it yet, but this new campaign at the world's edge would be their last great act. The land that awaited them would not remember their triumphs, only their disappearance. But before the legend of loss came the hard labor of conquest. Before the fog, there was the sea cold gray and full of promise. And as the Ninth's ships rocked in the channel, sails snapping in the wind, a soldier might have looked back toward the fading line of Gaul and thought, as Romans often did, that the empire's borders were not walls, but mirrors. Every step into the unknown was also a step deeper into themselves. When the dust of civil war finally settled, Rome had traded a republic for an emperor. Augustus, soft-spoken, calculating, patient, didn't roar like Caesar. He ruled by silence, by the steady heartbeat of administration. The legions, once tools of civil strife, were now the instruments of empire. And the Ninth, scarred veterans of 100 campaigns, found themselves reborn once again under this new age of order. By the time Augustus restructured the army, the Ninth was an institution, its veterans scattered across colonies from Spain to Syria, its standards gleaming in new hands. Fresh recruits filled its ranks, not just Italians now, but men from Gaul, Hispania, Illyria, and the Balkans. The Roman army had become a mirror of empire itself, provincial, multilingual, and terrifyingly efficient. Under Augustus's reforms, every legion became a fixed part of the imperial machine. 5,000 men, 10 cohorts, an eagle a name, and a permanent home somewhere along the empire's restless borders. They were no longer armies of individuals loyal to their general. They were state institutions, each with its own number seal and bureaucracy. The men of the Ninth had gone from being Caesar's wolves to being Rome's accountants of war. Their duties changed too. Gone were the days of constant campaigning. Now came the grind of garrison life, building forts, policing borders, enforcing taxes, and occasionally, very occasionally, fighting. In the army's ledgers, victories were measured not by blood spilled, but by years of quiet stability. And yet, discipline remained absolute. Augustus had seen what undisciplined legions could do to the Senate, to cities, to Rome itself. So he rewired the system from the ground up. Legions were tied to long-term provincial bases, soldiers bound to 25 years of service, and the bureaucracy of supply and record-keeping expanded into something almost beautiful in its precision. For the men of the Ninth, this meant routine. Endless reports, endless drills, endless building. A Roman soldier, it was said, could march 20 miles, dig a moat, build a fort, and cook dinner all before sunset. The Ninth made it art. They built roads across Pannonia, bridges across the Danube, and camps whose ruins still outline the empire's reach. Archaeologists today find the same repeating pattern, the fingerprint of Rome stamped across Europe, rectangular fortresses with perfect symmetry, defensive ditches, stone barracks, command buildings, workshops, bathhouses. It's astonishing, really, a kind of martial urban planning that turned wilderness into architecture. But boredom, like rust, crept in. When you were not fighting barbarians, you were counting nails. You polished armor that would never see battle. You wrote letters on wax tablets sent to wives and children you weren't legally allowed to have. You trained every day for wars that might never come. And when war did come, it came without warning. The frontiers were never truly quiet. To the north, beyond the Rhine, the Germanic tribes watched Rome's creeping advance with suspicion. To the east, Parthia smoldered. And to the west in Spain, where the Ninth had earned its title, Hispana rebellion was never far from the mines and mountains. The Ninth saw action in Hispania around 25 BC, in the Cantabrian Wars, a brutal mountain campaign against tribes who fought like ghosts. The Cantabrians didn't form lines or march in ranks. They struck from fog, and stone melded back into forests and reappeared miles away by nightfall. It was a kind of warfare Rome didn't understand and hated. For 6 years, Augustus's legions fought in that stony wilderness. They built camps on impossible slopes, ferried supplies through ravines, and endured winters that turned iron brittle. The Ninth earned their place among the empire's hardened elite, and their name, Legio IX, Hispana, the Ninth Spanish Legion. By the campaign's end, the hills were quiet. The Ninth's eagle stood gleaming atop a captured mountain stronghold. They had done their duty, but the cost was high, not just in lives, but in spirit. Even Augustus himself, normally stoic, admitted that the wars in Spain had been fought more stubbornly than they were finished. When peace finally returned, Rome celebrated the illusion of stability. The emperor ordered temples, built coins, minted poets commissioned to sing of eternal peace, the Pax Romana. And somewhere on the northern frontier, the men of the Ninth sharpened their swords and laughed quietly to themselves. Peace was never eternal. Peace was just the space between dispatch orders. By 6 AD, the Ninth found itself stationed along the Rhine, watching the frontier's dark forests, with the same wary respect their fathers had learned in Gaul. Across the river, Germanic chieftains smiled, traded, and waited. The Romans, ever confident, built more roads, forts, and tax stations. Then came the storm, the Teutoburg Forest, 9 AD. 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, vanished into the trees and into history. Their loss was so total, their destruction so complete, that Rome never again used their numbers. Augustus tore at his hair, crying, "Give me back my legions." The Ninth station to the south escaped that fate, but the shock rippled through every camp in the empire. Veterans whispered prayers to the eagles before dawn. Sentries stared a little longer into the fog. To lose a legion wasn't just tragedy, it was blasphemy. And so the Ninth marched with renewed ferocity. In the years that followed, they were deployed to Pannonia and Moesia to crush revolts and guard the Danube frontier. They were the empire's fire brigade, called to wherever rebellion sparked. They built as often as they bled. Each campaign left its mark inscriptions on stone blocks, small altars dedicated to Jupiter or Mars, fragments of tiles stamped Legio Hispana. Those marks were meant to be eternal, Rome's graffiti carved into the bones of the world. And yet centuries later, all that certainty would vanish like smoke. For now, though, the ninth thrived. Under Augustus's successors, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, they became veterans of quiet conquest. When Claudius prepared his invasion of Britain in 43 AD, he needed legions that could handle the unknown men who had fought in mountains, survived rebellions, and could build an empire from scratch. The ninth fit perfectly. So they packed up their standards, polished their eagle, and marched to the coast of Gaul. The sea waited before them, gray cold and endlessly foreign. To the Romans, the channel was no simple crossing. It was a step into myth. Beyond it lay Britain, the island of Druids' fog and people painted blue. Standing on the shore, perhaps some veteran of Caesar's old campaigns squinted at the water and muttered a joke. We've conquered everything else. Might as well conquer the weather. Behind him, the wind whipped the banners of the ninth gold against the storm. They were no longer Caesar's legion, no longer the children of the Republic. They were professionals, now soldiers of an empire that promised eternity. And somewhere across that narrow strip of sea eternity was waiting to test them. The ninth Hispana would step into the fog of Britain and into legend. In the spring of 43 AD, as the winds shifted over the gray channel, the ninth Hispana stood on the cliffs of Gaul, watching the sea writhe like a living thing. The men had built bridges across the Rhine and walls across mountains, but this was different. The sea was a god they did not trust. They could smell the salt before they saw the waves. The Romans called this new frontier Britannia, the island beyond the known world. Even the name sounded like fog. For centuries, Britain had been a rumor, a place of tin and mystery, of painted warriors and moonlit rituals. Caesar himself had crossed once decades earlier, fought a few skirmishes, and then sailed home unimpressed and seasick. Now, Emperor Claudius wanted the island not as legend, but as province. The ninth's orders were simple and impossible: cross the sea land, safely build a camp, and begin the conquest of an entire world. Logistics first always. The army assembled at Gesoriacum, modern Boulogne, where shipwrights worked night and day to build a fleet that could carry nearly 40,000 men. The ninth veterans of 100 campaigns helped load the supplies, grain tools, siege engines, horses' amphorae of wine, and the hundreds of mundane objects that turned a war into an occupation. To move a legion across water was an act of faith. The Roman triremes were sturdy, but temperamental, built for rivers and coasts, not the open channel. The men called them bathtubs with ambitions, but when the winds finally calmed, the signal was given trumpets echoing across the shore, and the fleet set sail. Imagine it, the endless gray of the North Sea, the creak of oars, the slap of water against hulls. Soldiers packed shoulder-to-shoulder armor, gleaming dully in the mist, muttering prayers to Neptune. The veterans joked that the gods hated bureaucracy too much to drown them now. When they saw land, it wasn't welcoming. The white cliffs rose out of the fog, like the walls of another world. And above those cliffs, the British tribes waited not disciplined armies, but hundreds of warriors with painted faces, long hair, and chariots that rattled like thunder. To the Romans, it was chaos. To the Britons, it was home. The first landings were messy arrows hissing down from the bluffs, horses panicking on the surf legionaries struggling to keep formation as they waded through waist-deep water. But discipline, as always, turned disaster into design. Shields locked lines reformed, and the ninth pushed forward step by step until the beach was theirs. The invaders built their first camp before sunset, a perfect rectangle of trenches and palisades geometry rising from mud. And when the rain came, as it always did, they stood inside the walls and told themselves they were building eternity. Britain, they quickly learned, was not Gaul. The land was colder, wetter, older. The forests were vast, dripping with rain and superstition. The tribes fought like the earth itself, vanishing, reappearing, striking from fog and tree. The Romans called them barbarians, but privately they respected them. These were not farmers with spears. They were hunters, priests, and poets who knew every hill and stream by name. The Ninth marched inland along the Thames, cutting roads through marsh and forest, driving piles into the mud to build bridges. Their engineers became sorcerers of logistics. Each day they built a new camp. Each night they slept inside the geometry of safety. When battle came, it was chaos wrapped in rhythm. The Britons attacked with chariots, 2 men per car, one driving, one hurling spears, racing across the field in blurs of bronze and wood. The wheels hummed, the horses screamed, and for a heartbeat the sound alone could unnerve a man. But the Ninth were professionals. They had seen elephants in Africa and cavalry in Gaul. Chariots were just one more problem to solve. At the order, they braced their shields and hurled their pila heavy javelins designed to bend on impact. They targeted the horses, not the men. Within moments, the proud chariots of Britain became broken carts in the mud. The Legion, advanced testudo formation shields, interlocked a living wall of iron. Step by step, they pushed the Britons back until the field was quiet, except for the caw of distant crows. After each battle came the same ritual rebuild: the road, fortify the crossing, raise an altar to Jupiter. The Ninth's engineers were as vital as their swords. Wherever they camped, towns would one day grow. In the months that followed, the Roman advance split the island's tribes. Some surrendered, others retreated west into forests and hills. Claudius himself, ever the politician, crossed the channel with elephants and pomp to claim the victory, personally arriving only after the hard work was done. The legionaries joked that he was the bravest man to appear after the danger was gone. Still, Rome was generous in victory. Cities were founded: Londinium, Camulodunum, Verulamium, their names destined to survive centuries of ruin. Roads fanned outward from the coast straight as laws. Temples rose beside rivers that once echoed with battle cries. And the Ninth, stationed in the north, became the empire's anchor on the island. They built bridges over the Ouse forts and York outposts in Lincoln. They policed the conquered south and watched the restless tribes beyond. To them, the island was a mixture of triumph and exile, too far from Rome to feel civilized, too Roman now to ever be wild again. But conquest, as always, carried a price. The local tribes watched the occupiers with wary eyes. The Romans demanded taxes, slaves, tribute. Governors grew greedy, soldiers arrogant. And under the damp skies of Britain, resentment began to ferment, slowly, quietly, like wine left too long to sour. Still, for now, peace held. The Ninth's eagle stood over new-built stone walls, its golden wings catching the northern sun. The men joked, train drank, and rode home about the strangeness of Britain, the endless fog, the beer that tasted like river water, the locals who spoke in riddles. And yet, beneath their humor, there was unease. The landscape itself felt alive. Hills that whispered in the wind, groves where druids still gathered in secret. Roman discipline could pave the roads, but it could not tame the silence between trees. The Ninth was learning that this island could not be conquered by geometry alone. Still, they endured because endurance was what they did best. As their engineers raised fortresses across the north, the legion's veterans must have wondered if they would ever see the sun-baked stones of Italy again. Some had been in service 20 years already, long enough to forget the color of home. But their names were written in the rolls, their loyalty recorded in bronze, their presence stamped into every bridge and wall they built. They believed Rome would remember them, but one day, history itself would misplace their name. For now, though, Britannia belonged to them, or so they thought. They had marched to the edge of the world and raised the eagle there. They did not know that the edge had teeth. The trouble began, as rebellions often do, with money and humiliation. By 60 AD, Britain had been under Roman occupation for almost 2 decades. Roads stitched the island together, like scars temples to Roman gods, rose where oak groves once stood, and governors wrote glowing letters to the emperor boasting of order and prosperity. But under that fragile surface, resentment burned. The Roman tax collectors had grown greedy, the governors cruel, and the legions complacent. The empire thought the island tamed. It wasn't. At the heart of that storm stood a woman, tall, fierce, with hair the color of fire, and a mind sharper than any Roman's comfort could imagine. Her name was Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe. To her people, she was not just a ruler. She was the living spirit of the land. Her husband, King Prasutagus, had been one of Rome's client kings, allowed to rule under the empire's shadow, in exchange for loyalty and taxes. When he died, he left a will meant to ensure peace, dividing his wealth between his daughters and the Emperor Nero himself. In Roman law, that was a gesture of faith. In Roman practice, it was an invitation for vultures. The governor of Britain, Suetonius Paulinus, saw opportunity. Roman officials descended on Iceni lands like locusts, seizing property, enslaving nobles, demanding debts no one remembered borrowing. When Boudica protested, the soldiers flogged her publicly. Her daughters were assaulted. Rome thought it had crushed another provincial queen. Instead, it had created a legend. Word spread across the tribes through smoke signals, whispered oaths, and secret gatherings beneath sacred trees. The Trinovantes, long humiliated by Roman colonists in their old capital of Camulodunum. Modern Colchester joined her. Then others followed. The Druids blessed her cause. By the time the Romans realized what was happening, half the island was burning with rebellion. The first target was Camulodunum itself, the proud Roman colonia built on confiscated tribal lands, home to veterans of the legions, and a towering temple to the deified Claudius. To the Britons, it was a monument to everything Rome had stolen. The city had no walls. The veterans there believed they didn't need any who would dare defy Rome. The answer came with fire. At dawn, Boudica's forces, tens of thousands strong, surrounded the city. They carried spears, torches, and the kind of fury that doesn't negotiate. The temple defenders fought for 2 days before the building collapsed in smoke. The streets became rivers of flame. By the time it was over, the colonia was ash and the veterans' families were gone. News reached the 9th Legion's camp at Longthorpe. Their commander, Quintus Petilius Cerialis, was a seasoned officer, brave, confident, and too sure of Rome's invincibility. He gathered what men he could, roughly 2,000 legionaries and auxiliaries, and marched south to put down the disturbance. It was the last time anyone in that column saw Rome's order. Boudica knew he was coming. Scouts watched the Roman column's every move. Her warriors waited in the forests along the Roman road, men and women, both painted blue, with woad singing battle songs older than the Latin language itself. When the 9th entered the valley, near what is now Peterborough, the earth seemed to move. Chariots burst from the trees, spears rained from every direction, and the air filled with the sound of horns and screams. The Romans tried to form ranks, but the ground was soft, the road narrow, and the enemy endless. The Britons knew exactly where to strike the supply wagons first, then the cavalry, then the heart of the column. The disciplined formation dissolved into chaos. Cerialis fought hard. He was no coward. He tried to rally his men, calling for the standards for the eagle, but the noise swallowed his voice. Soldiers died around him, trapped by their own carts and beasts. The few survivors hacked their way through the onslaught and fled north. The legion was effectively annihilated. Its infantry was gone, its pride burned. Cerialis escaped with his cavalry, but the damage was done. The news reached Rome like a slap. The invincible 9th Legion veterans of Caesar, conquerors of Gaul, the builders of Britain's roads destroyed by barbarians. The island erupted in flames. Boudicca's army swept onward, a storm of vengeance. They reached Londinium, still a young, thriving trade hub, and burned it to the ground. The wooden streets became a furnace. The Thames ran black with smoke. Then came Verulamium, modern St. Albans, another Roman town reduced to ash. Archaeologists today can still trace the layer of destruction, a dark red band in the soil full of charred beams, broken pottery, melted glass, and bones. The burn layer of 60 AD. You can hold it in your hand, the physical fingerprint of rage. When Governor Suetonius Paulinus returned from his campaign in Wales, he faced an island in revolt and a Roman reputation in ruins. He gathered what forces remained, the 14th Legion parts of the 20th, and scattered auxiliaries. The 9th was a ghost. At the Battle of Watling Street, Boudicca's army met Rome's wrath. The Britons outnumbered the Romans by perhaps 10 to 1, but numbers can't defeat discipline forever. Suetonius chose his ground carefully, a narrow defile flanked by woods. When the Britons charged their wagons, trapped them from behind. Rome's legions did what Rome's legions always did. They waited absorbed and then killed with mathematical precision. By day's end, the plain was red and the rebellion was broken. Boudicca, refusing capture, took her own life, poison legend says, in a silver cup. The Romans buried her somewhere unknown, though some whisper her grave lies beneath a modern London train station. The 9th's humiliation, however, was not so easily buried. Their defeat had been catastrophic, but not total. Survivors limped back to camp, a handful of broken men, their eagle miraculously saved or quietly replaced. Rome would not let the number die. Reinforcements came from the Rhine. Fresh recruits, new armor, new standards. The 9th Hispana was rebuilt, but the stain on its honor never fully faded. And yet Rome's memory was selective. The official reports downplayed the loss. The records grew vague. Later generations would remember the 9th's destruction in Caledonia, not in Essex, a bureaucratic act of mercy by history itself. But in the taverns and barracks of Britain, soldiers told the story differently. They said the ghosts of the 9th still walked the road south of Peterborough on misty nights, their shields dented their eyes blank with disbelief. They said if you listened hard enough, you could hear the echo of marching feet and the distant scream of a Roman trumpet swallowed by forest. Rome, of course, ignored such superstition. It rebuilt its temples, renamed its governors, and pretended the empire had never trembled. The 9th, restored to full strength, returned to duty, guarding the same land that had nearly devoured them. But something had changed. The soldiers now understood that Rome's control of Britain was fragile, that beneath every mile of straight road and every column of marble, the land still remembered who it belonged to. The British sun was weak, but its shadows were long. And in those shadows, the legend of the 9th Hispana, the legion that burned rebuilt and would one day vanish, began to take root. After the fires of Boudicca's revolt guttered out, the ashes settled thick on everything, on the charred ruins of Camulodunum and Londinium, on the abandoned villas of dead colonists, and on the reputation of the Ninth Hispana. They had been humbled, gutted, and humiliated a Roman legion torn apart, not by foreign invaders, but by barbarians they were supposed to civilize. For a while it seemed that the Ninth might join those cursed numbers Rome never spoke again, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, lost in the forests of Germania. But Rome was a creature that could not admit defeat. To dissolve the Ninth would be to confess weakness, so instead, it resurrected them. Reinforcements came from the Rhine and the Danube, young men who had never set foot in Britain, and veterans transferred from other legions. The survivors, those few who had crawled out of the trap alive, were folded into the new ranks. Their eyes were older, their humor sharper, their stories darker. They taught the newcomers what the island really was: not a province, but a trap with good beer and bad weather. The new commander, Quintus Petilius Carialis, the same man who had led them into disaster, was later restored to favor and sent back to Britain as governor under the Emperor Vespasian. History is ironic like that. Carialis, now older and wiser, would oversee the legion's rebirth and redemption. The Ninth rebuilt its camp, its pride, and its walls. They strengthened the fortresses along the frontiers and resumed the endless business of being Roman paving roads, raising altars, collecting taxes, and training until their arms felt like stone. They were ghosts, wearing new armor, yet their defeat had changed them in ways no bureaucrat could measure. Soldiers who had stared into the face of annihilation became colder, more practical, less trusting of Rome's illusions of invincibility. They still cheered at parades, still saluted the eagle, but in their eyes flickered something new: understanding. Empires weren't eternal. They just pretended well. And Britain still smoldered. To the south, Roman towns were rebuilt neater, grander, as if marble could erase memory. To the north, however, the tribes watched waiting. Rome called them Caledoni, the hard men of the highlands, and they were different from the southern tribes who had learned to trade, to flatter, to survive. The Caledonians didn't build cities or sign treaties. They lived in the mountains and forests, and they had learned what even Boudica hadn't: patience. It was under Governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola, a shrewd and tireless commander, that the Ninth would march north again, this time not to punish rebellion, but to test the limits of the world. Agricola arrived in Britain in 77 AD, with orders to stabilize the province, and if possible, expand Rome's reach beyond the known frontiers. He brought with him his daughter's husband, a historian named Tacitus, who would later immortalize him in a book full of Stoic praise and political subtext. Agricola was the kind of general who could win with both sword and shovel. He understood logistics as well as tactics, and he trusted the engineers as much as the infantry. Build the road first, he reportedly said, then victory will follow it. The Ninth, freshly reconstituted and eager to prove themselves, became one of his key instruments. Their scars had hardened into discipline. They built forts as they advanced a line of Roman geometry, pushing ever deeper into the fog. The forts were like beads on a string: Chester, York, Carlisle, Corbridge, each one a day's march from the next, each one a small piece of Rome hammered into alien soil. At York, they began work on what would become one of the most famous Roman fortresses in Britain Iberacum. It started as a standard marching camp, a rectangle of trenches and turf walls beside the river Ouse. But the Ninth built with the confidence of permanence. They used local limestone for the wall's timber, for the barracks, and clay tiles stamped with their legion's mark, Legnium Hisp. Even now, archaeologists still find those tiles buried beneath modern York, small silent signatures of soldiers who believed they were writing eternity. Between campaigns, life in the fortress was a strange blend of bureaucracy and boredom. At dawn, the trumpet called the men from their barracks. The day's tasks were assigned guard duty construction, weapon drills, tax collection, even paperwork. A Roman legion produced more documents than most modern offices. Every spear issued, every death recorded, every brick counted. In the evenings, the soldiers relaxed in the thermae, the bathhouses they built wherever they went, steaming sanctuaries of gossip and soap. They gambled, drank, and grumbled about everything, from the rain to the price of wine. Letters found centuries later at Vindolanda, another frontier fort show, soldiers complaining that their boots leaked, that the beer was terrible, that they missed home. It turns out, empire is just as human as everything else. The Ninth's veterans must have smiled grimly at those complaints. They knew what real discomfort was. Agricola, meanwhile, was planning something audacious to push north into Caledonia, the mountainous heart of modern Scotland, and to build a frontier system that could hold it. The Ninth, along with the 20th and other auxiliary units, would blaze the trail. The legion marched into lands of mist and rock, where even the trees looked suspicious. The Caledonian tribes fought guerrilla style, vanishing into the hills after every strike. For the Romans accustomed to roads and formations, it was like fighting ghosts. Rain soaked the scrolls, rusted the armor, and turned every march into a river crossing. Still, they advanced. Each fort they built was both promise and defiance. We are still here. In these years, the Ninth's reputation slowly mended. They became reliable again, the kind of legion governors trusted to hold the line while others faltered. Their eagle, once lost to humiliation, gleamed again above the parade ground. Carialis had failed them, but Agricola made them believe in command once more. Agricola's campaign northward would culminate in a confrontation so large and so mysterious, it would live in both Roman and Scottish legend, the Battle of Mons Graupius. But before that climactic clash, the Ninth spent years as Rome's northern engineers, carving fortresses out of wilderness. They watched their empire transform in slow motion. Timber forts turned to stone trading posts, turned to towns. Native chieftains turned to tax collectors. Every day, the same ceremony, salute the eagle, record the names, mark the passage of time. If you stood on the walls of York in those years and looked north, you could almost see the future Hadrian's Wall not yet built, but waiting in the imagination of engineers unborn. The moors stretching endlessly, indifferent to conquest. For the men of the Ninth, that horizon was both promise and threat. Beyond it lay glory or erasure. They didn't know it yet, but their name was already beginning to blur in the paperwork of history. Even as they rebuilt themselves, the empire they served was already beginning its long, slow drift toward forgetting. But for now, for this brief golden stretch of years, the Ninth Hispana had clawed its way back from disgrace. They were whole again. They had roads to build, walls to raise, and orders to follow. And soon, the northern winds would call them into the highlands, into a war that would test every lesson Rome had ever learned. It was the summer of 80 AD, and the Ninth Hispana was once again on the march northward, this time beyond the edge of maps, into the damp heart of the world the Romans called Caledonia. The soldiers joked about it in the usual way, that they were off to conquer fog and sheep, but beneath the humor lay unease. The veterans remembered what had happened the last time Rome underestimated an island. Caledonia was not Britain as they knew it. It was wilder, darker, older. The hills were steep, the forests endless, the rivers wide and cold enough to turn a man's bones to glass. The locals were giants, or seemed to be tall, fair-haired, tattooed their eyes like ice. The Romans thought them part of the same Celtic race as the southern Britons. But the truth was more complex. These people, the Caledoni, and the tribes beyond were used to hardship. They lived where the soil barely fed them, where the sea took as much as it gave. They were fighters by geography. Governor Agricola, the empire's patient architect of conquest, understood that. He didn't bluster. He measured. His campaigns were like engineering projects, meticulously planned, brutally efficient. Each push northward came with a network of roads and forts, ensuring no victory ever drifted into wilderness again. Win once, hold forever, he liked to say. The Ninth marched in that machine of progress, their standards gleaming against the gray sky. At night, when the mist rolled in, they built their camp the same way they always had: ditches, ramparts, watchtowers, gates facing the cardinal directions. It was ritual as much as strategy. You could drop a Roman legion into any field in the world, and by sundown, they'd built a city. But in Caledonia, the enemy wasn't just the tribes, it was the land itself. The rain fell sideways. The mud swallowed cartwheels. Horses broke legs in bogs that looked like meadows. Sometimes in the long twilight, the soldiers swore they could hear drums echoing from the hills. The tribes knew the land intimately. They struck at night, burned supply wagons, ambushed scouting parties, and vanished before the Romans could form ranks. Agricola adapted breaking his forces into smaller units, teaching them to move like hunters rather than juggernauts. The Ninth learned to fight in silence, to march without torches, to sleep in armor. Still, the isolation gnawed at them. Letters home took months if they arrived at all. Most soldiers didn't bother writing. The army's paymaster deducted their wages automatically. The bureaucracy of Rome was more reliable than the sea. But for all its efficiency, it couldn't stop the loneliness that came with hearing the same rain on the same tent canvas for the 1,000th night. There were moments of respite. When they found local allies, the Romans built trading posts and negotiated grain deliveries in exchange for protection. The Caledonian chiefs, who played both sides, were pragmatic. Gold spends better than pride. The legion's campfires flickered beside those of the locals, their languages blending in the night. Some soldiers even took native wives or companions, quiet unions that would never be recognized in Roman law, but left descendants who would one day call themselves Britons. The Ninth's engineers became legends among the army. They could build a bridge over a swamp in a day, pave a road through rock in a week, and raise a fort in the time it took most men to complain about dinner. The roads they laid straight as fate cut through the highlands like scars. Some still exist today, hidden under moss and asphalt, the ghosts of Roman ambition pressed into the earth. By 81 AD, Agricola's forces had pushed farther north than any Roman army before or since. They built a line of forts along what historians now call the Gask Ridge, stretching across the narrow waste of Scotland, from the Firth of Tay to the Firth of Clyde. It was a chain of watchtowers and garrisons, manned by detachments from the Ninth and other legions. Each tower could signal the next with fire or smoke. Communication was swift, but the terrain was merciless. For the men stationed in those lonely forts, life became timeless. A century here, a century there, 10 men sharing a cramped wooden blockhouse surrounded by heather and silence. They drank rough barley beer, patched their cloaks with sheepskin, and stared into fog that never seemed to lift. The Caledonian winds moaned through the cracks like voices. And yet, Rome's rhythm continued: the same drills, the same inspections, the same paperwork. Even at the end of the world, the empire demanded its forms filled and its ledgers balanced. The Ninth's clerk, in one of those outposts, might have sat beneath a leaking roof, dipping a quill into ink to record how many spades had gone missing that week. The absurdity of empire at work. When spring came, Agricola gathered the legions again for what everyone knew would be the final push. He had spent years preparing, mapping the terrain, learning from captured scouts, studying the tribe's alliances. The Caledonian leader, Calgacus, had united the Highland clans into something resembling a confederation. Rome could not allow that. Agricola would crush them once and for all, and the ninth would march at his side. Tacitus, Agricola's future son-in-law, would later write that the Caledonians gathered an army of 30,000 men, though Roman numbers always grew or shrank to fit the drama. What mattered was that they outnumbered the invaders. And yet Agricola didn't hesitate. He marched his forces north through forest and mountain until they reached the high moorlands near a place the locals called Mons Graupius. The ninth pitched camp on a slope overlooking a wide valley. Below them stretched the Caledonian host lines upon lines of warriors, their bronze torques glinting, their chariots rattling along the ridges. They sang through the mist a low rhythmic chant that even seasoned Romans found unsettling. The sound carried like thunder, rolling over stone. Agricola's speech before the battle was short and practical. He didn't talk of glory or empire. He told his soldiers that this was the last barrier between them and peace, that beyond this field lay safety, pay, and home. He promised them one thing, that the rain would stop when the fighting began. And in a way, it did. The Battle of Mons Graupius unfolded in a blur of noise and movement. The Caledonians charged downhill, their long spears and chariots slicing through the fog. The Romans met them with discipline so sharp it looked supernatural shields, locking Pila, flying the ninth, holding the center, while auxiliaries swept the flanks. Tacitus would later write that 10,000 Caledonians fell that day for the loss of only 300 Romans. Historians doubt the numbers, but not the brutality. The field was slick with mud and blood by nightfall, and the cries of the dying echoed down the glen long after the fighting ended. When it was over, Agricola stood on the ridge and looked north. The land stretched away into mist and myth. He had done what no Roman had before he had conquered the north. And yet even he must have known that it wouldn't last. The tribes melted away into the hills. There were no cities to capture, no rulers to execute, no walls to mark a border. You can conquer a land of people. You cannot conquer a land of wind. For the ninth Mons, Graupius was both triumph and warning. They had survived again, rebuilt, redeemed, rehardened. But they had also seen the truth that every Roman legion eventually learned some victories are too far from Rome to matter. The highlands were quiet before dawn, too quiet for comfort. A thin mist clung to the slopes, silver and ghostly, and the smell of heather mixed with iron in the air. Down below, thousands of Caledonian warriors gathered in rough ranks, their faces streaked with ash and ochre. The Romans, from their elevated camp, watched in silence. They had never seen so many of them together before tribes united, if only for this one desperate moment. For months, Governor Agricola's campaign had driven these people farther north, from hill to hill, forest to forest, until there was nowhere left to retreat. Now they stood here ready to fight or die, not for conquest, but for breath. The Romans, meanwhile, were fighting for something more fragile: paperwork. The empire needed closure, a victory that could be written down, stamped and filed as Britain secured. The ninth Hispana, stationed in the center of the line, tightened their formation as the horns began to sound. Across the valley, the Caledonians raised a deafening cry, not words, but pure defiance. Spears struck shields. Chariots rattled, drums pounded like thunder trapped in the earth. To the men of the ninth, who had fought Germans, Spaniards, Gauls, and Britons before, this still felt different. The sound didn't come from one direction. It came from the land itself. Agricola, composed as ever, rode along the ranks. He was not a man of grand speeches. He told them only what soldiers ever really need to hear, that they had come too far to turn back, and that the gods of Rome were watching. He reminded them that they were the wall between civilization and chaos, the thin red line between empire and oblivion. Then the signal went up, a single trumpet note, cutting through the fog like a blade. The auxiliaries moved first, sprinting down the slope with light armor and curved shields. Behind them came the legionaries, 6,000 men, moving as one, shields locked, pila raised. The ninth held steady in the center, their eagle glittering in the half-light, the brass catching the weak northern sun. The Caledonians charged. They came screaming down the hill, bare-chested, their long swords flashing, their chariots bouncing over the uneven ground. To the Romans, they looked like something out of a nightmare, warriors with hair wild as storm clouds, their war cries echoing off the stone. The first clash was chaos. Arrows hissed, pila flew, shields splintered. The air filled with the dull percussion of iron on iron. A Roman's world in battle was small, the width of his shield, the man to his left, the ground under his feet. The ninth advanced by inches, pushing forward against the oncoming tide, every heartbeat a calculation of survival. Tacitus would later write, "They fought not for freedom, but for glory." He was wrong, of course. Both sides fought for something deeper. The Caledonians fought to stay unmeasured, uncounted, untamed. The Romans fought to make the unknown legible. The hillside became a geometry of death. Caledonian warriors hurled themselves at the Roman line, again and again, their fury unmatched. The Romans responded with efficiency that bordered on cruelty, stabbing low, stepping forward, repeating. The ninth centurions barked orders, and the formation flexed like a single creature, absorbing the blows, then striking back. At one point, the Caledonian chariots broke through the flank, scattering auxiliaries and cutting into the Roman rear. Panic threatened to spread, but a cohort of the ninth pivoted a seamless maneuver, drilled 1,000 times in dusty parade grounds, and met them head-on. Chariots shattered against their shields. The Caledonian driver, thrown from his cart, landed at the foot of a Roman soldier who didn't even pause before driving his gladius downward. The ninth pressed forward the line of shields, advancing like a tide. When one man fell, another stepped into his place. Hours passed in the blur of noise and exhaustion. The Caledonians fought with the strength of desperation, but the Roman machine didn't tire, didn't rage, didn't hesitate. By midday, the slope ran red. The Caledonian formation broke, scattering into the mist. The Romans pursued only so far. They knew better than to chase ghosts into the hills. Agricola stood on the ridge, watching the smoke rise from the battlefield, his face unreadable. He had won decisively, magnificently, and yet there was no joy in it. Tacitus would claim that 10,000 Caledonians fell that day for the loss of only 300 Romans. The numbers, as always, were propaganda, but the scale of slaughter was real. When the Romans counted their dead, they found among them a few from the ninth, not many, but enough. A legion never forgets its losses, even when the state prefers to. When the fighting ended, the Romans set to work in the only way they knew how, cleaning, cataloging, building. They buried their own, stripped the enemy dead of valuables, and recorded names for the pay ledgers. Even victory had a bureaucracy. Agricola ordered the battlefield burned. Piles of wooden shields, broken spears, and chariot wheels were set ablaze, sending a black column of smoke into the sky. The soldiers said it looked like the soul of the island leaving its body. That night, the ninth camped at the base of the hill. The men ate in silence. No songs, no laughter, only the crackle of fires and the distant sound of crows. They knew they had fought well, perhaps even perfectly. But perfect victories have a strange emptiness to them. The next morning, Agricola gave the order to continue north. His scouts reached the edge of the highlands, saw nothing but mist and endless sea, and returned. The general stood there on the edge of the known world and understood that he had reached the limit of what could be ruled. Beyond this point, maps would always lie. The Ninth would linger in Caledonia for a while longer, garrisoning forts, chasing raiders, and holding the ghostly line they'd drawn in the hills. But the empire was already calling them back south. Rome didn't have the appetite for another endless frontier. By the year's end, Agricola was recalled to the capital, replaced by a lesser man with safer ambitions. His conquest of northern Britain would fade quickly from official memory. Too remote, too expensive, too inconvenient. The Ninth marched back to York, their boots echoing on the stone roads they themselves had built. They had crossed rivers, mountains, and centuries of myth, only to find themselves exactly where they started, guardians of a province that was never truly Rome's. But as they descended from the highlands, some of them must have looked back at the mist-covered ridges and wondered what they were leaving behind. Not just land, but silence. The kind of silence that swallows history. When the Ninth Hispana marched back south from the highlands, they did so as ghosts carrying triumph on their backs. The banners were tattered, but unbroken. The eagle still gleamed beneath a gray sky, and the men, those who had survived, bore the proud exhaustion of soldiers who'd seen the edge of the world and come home again. Home, of course, was relative. For the Legion, home was never Italy or Spain anymore. It was the fortress they built and rebuilt, the stones they carved with their initials, the same routines repeated until they blurred into identity. Their home now was Iberacum, modern York, the beating heart of Roman Britain's northern frontier. When they arrived, the city was still little more than a scar on the land, earth ramparts, timber walls, and the smell of wet limestone from the quarries nearby. The Ninth had helped build it before they'd marched north, and now they came to finish what they had started. Over the next decade, Iberacum transformed from a fortress into a town, and from a town into something almost Roman. The city had the same bones as every fortress of the empire, a perfect grid. The Via Praetoria ran straight through the heart of the camp, flanked by the Principia, the headquarters, and the Praetorium, the commander's house. There were granaries for wheat workshops, for metal temples for Jupiter and the emperor, and barracks that echoed with laughter curses and the clatter of dice at night. If you'd walked through Eboracum in those days, you'd have seen the contradictions of empire compressed into one place. Roman officers in polished armor buying honey from Celtic farmers, local women selling wool and gossip in Latin accents that made the soldiers laugh, traders hawking amphorae of Spanish wine beside stalls of carved jet from Whitby. Smoke rose from the bathhouses, and the air smelled of wood smoke oil and ambition. The Ninth Hispana had become, once again, the muscle of the North, holding the line against tribes beyond the hills, repairing roads, building watchtowers along the rivers. The Caledonians had retreated into their highlands, defeated but unbroken. Rome, as always, declared victory and moved on. Years passed. Emperors changed. The paperwork never stopped. But in the stillness between campaigns, strange things began to happen in the borderlands. At the edge of empire, the difference between rumor and truth is always small. Merchants whispered of forts attacked in the night patrols, vanishing into the moors, and northern tribes gathering again beyond the horizon. The locals called them the Maiatai and Caledoni, but to the Romans, they were simply the people beyond the wall. Only there was no wall yet. Not the one you're thinking of. Hadrian's Wall, that monumental barrier of stone and turf that would one day slice across northern England, was still decades away. In its place was something quieter, but just as telling, the Staingate Line. This was Rome's first experiment in dividing the island, a string of forts and roads stretching from Carlisle to Corbridge, manned by detachments from the legions including the Ninth. The road itself was an engineering marvel, straight, deliberate, defiant. You could walk it and feel Rome's arrogance under your feet. Each fort, was a miniature world barracks, granaries, stables, bathhouses, temples, and the endless paperwork of empire. The soldiers stationed there would spend years watching fog roll over the same valleys, their lives measured in patrol routes and pay cycles. A Roman legionary's calendar didn't use months. It used assignments: guard duty, fort duty, road duty, burial detail. Sometimes they'd get letters from home, brittle wax tablets with cramped handwriting. "I hope you are well. Send money for sandals. The baby is sick again." Little fragments of humanity in an empire that thought itself immortal. The winters were long. The rain came sideways. Fires struggled to stay lit in the damp air. The soldiers adapted. They grew beards against the cold, traded for wool cloaks. From the locals, learned to drink the local barley beer. They stopped caring that it was brewed in old cauldrons, once used for sacrifices. After enough winters, superstition became comfort. The army was always supposed to feel eternal, an iron machine that would outlast men. But in those years after Agricola's campaigns, the 9th Hispana began to fade at the edges. Not yet vanished, but thinner. Detached cohorts sent to the Rhine, new recruits brought in from Gaul, veterans discharged and never replaced. Like parchment, left too long in damp air, their story began to blur. Still, they endured. They kept the peace. They built. They waited. Archaeology gives us glimpses of them from this quiet century. A stone inscription found in York, bearing the words Legio Hispana, dedicated to the emperor by the loyal and brave men of the 9th. It's dated roughly to 108 AD. After that, nothing. That inscription stands like a gravestone for the known history of the Legion, their last clear breath in the records. After it, the empire's paperwork goes silent. The rolls skip a line. The scribes move on to other units. But if you were to ask the soldiers themselves in those final years whether they felt forgotten, they would have laughed. How could Rome forget them? They were the builders of Eboracum, the conquerors of Caledonia, the living wall between civilization and chaos. Yet the silence crept in, slowly, like mist through a camp. The border grew restless. Small raids turned into full-scale attacks. The garrison stretched thin. Some forts were overrun and rebuilt, others quietly abandoned. It's easy now, centuries later, to see it as foreshadowing the slow erasure of a name. But to the men of the 9th, it was just another day. Another patrol in the rain. Another letter unwritten. Another nail hammered into a barrack wall that no one would ever dig up again. By the time Hadrian came to power in 117 AD, the empire was weary of endless expansion. His solution was simple: stop pretending. He drew borders where ambition had once drawn lines in the sand. He ordered the construction of great fortifications, first in the Rhineland, then across Britain, and so the work began on the Great Wall, stone by stone, ditch by ditch, a project that would stretch from coast to coast. But by then, the 9th was no longer listed among the legions in active service. Did they march north one last time and vanish in battle? Were they transferred quietly to another frontier? Or were they simply dissolved, absorbed into new formations, their names struck from the rolls to hide an embarrassment no one wanted to record? No one knows. What we do know is that Eboracum, the city they built, endured. Other legions came and went. Emperors rose and fell. The baths filled with new soldiers' laughter. But the 9th's mark remained carved into tiles, stamped into bricks, echoing faintly in the stones. If you walk through modern York on a cold evening, when the river mist creeps through the narrow streets, you might still feel it, the heartbeat of something ancient beneath your feet. A rhythm of marching, hammering breathing, the sound of men who believed they were building forever. And maybe in a way they did. because long after their names vanished from Rome's scrolls, the walls they built still whisper, Eboracum. Rome called it a castra, a fortress, but by the time the Ninth Hispana settled there for good, it was already becoming something greater. It was memory, given shape, a city that remembered the rhythm of the legion's feet. From the air, if a Roman could ever have seen it that way, the fortress looked like a carved tablet, perfect right angles, every street and rampart placed as if drawn by compass. Even now, you can trace the outline beneath the modern city of York, the same geometry, the same logic, the same Roman hunger for order over chaos. But in the years after Mons Graupius, it wasn't triumph that defined Eboracum. It was patience. The Ninth Hispana was posted there to hold the north, the restless, rain-washed land between civilization and the unknown. To the south, Rome's world of tiled roofs and wine amphorae. To the north, mist and myth. Eboracum stood between them, half stone, half fog. And every morning, when the trumpet sounded across the fortress courtyard, that border came alive. At dawn, the signifer would lift the eagle standard before the headquarters, the Principia, its gold catching the pale light like a small sun. Around it, hundreds of soldiers gathered armor, clinking softly, breath clouding in the chill air. Orders were read, shifts assigned. One cohort would be on patrol, another on road-building duty, another training with dull swords in the rain. Then, like clockwork, the army's heartbeat began the measured thunder of marching boots on stone streets. Life inside a Roman fortress was routine, rigid, rhythmic, repetitive. But to the men of the Ninth, those rhythms were the closest thing to meaning left in a world that kept forgetting them. There were moments of beauty, too. The bathhouses were their sanctuaries, warm, fog-filled, perfumed with oil and chatter. There the legionaries gossiped about the empire, the mad emperor Domitian, and his endless paranoia, the new fashions in Rome, the price of olive oil in Gaul. They complained about the food, of course, always the food. Same grain, different pot, they'd grumble. But when they were submerged in the heat for a few minutes, the wind and the mud of Britain disappeared. Outside the walls, a town was growing, the civilian settlement, the vicus. Traders, craftsmen, and families of soldiers who weren't supposed to exist, but always did. It smelled of smoke and meat and human ambition. Children played with miniature swords made of wood, imitating the drills of their fathers. Local women sold honey and wool, at the gates their Celtic braids tied with Roman coins. Languages mingled in the marketplace, Latin, Brythonic, Gaulish, the occasional Germanic bark from a wandering trader. The empire was always a conversation, not a monologue. Inside the headquarters, the clerks worked their quiet magic, the endless miracle of Roman administration. On wax tablets, they wrote the daily strength reports, who was fit, who was sick, who had died. Each death required 3 witnesses and a note for the quartermaster to redistribute the armor. Even eternity needed accountants. We know their handwriting. Literally. At archaeological digs in York, fragments of these wooden tablets have been found messages between soldiers, orders, receipts, even one addressed to my brother asking him to send more socks and sandals because the weather is unbearable. 2,000 years later, those words are still legible. If ghosts can write, that's what it looks like. The Ninth's crest, leg 9, Hispana, appeared on tiles, bricks, even cooking pots. Their stamp was everywhere, a kind of bureaucratic graffiti. We were here. It's strange, isn't it? They built everything as if they would last forever. Yet none of them could imagine that one day those small marks would be all that remained. But there were still rumors. Out on the frontier, small uprisings flared and faded. Patrols vanished, then reappeared days later, silent and pale. Stories of strange lights in the hills of ambushes in the fog. Nothing large enough to merit panic, just the usual murmurs of empire. Rome didn't like whispers. It preferred reports. The Ninth was stretched thin. Detachments sent north to man the Staingate line, others sent west to aid the 20th Legion in Wales. The fortress emptied and refilled like a lung. Still, the routines continued. The Temple of Mithras grew popular among the officers, a mysterious cult from the east, worshipping a god born from stone. Its initiates gathered underground in torchlight, reenacting the slaying of the sacred bull. For men stationed on the edge of the world, that story light triumphing over darkness must have felt reassuring. In the evenings, the mess halls buzzed with noise. Soldiers rolled dice, carved their initials into tables, told the same jokes they'd told in Gaul and Spain in Pannonia. The veterans still teased the newcomers. Wait until you've seen a Caledonian winter. You'll beg for Gaul's mud. Laughter, wine, arguments, songs. The Legion was alive if tired, and yet beneath it all, a thin thread of melancholy ran through the place. Too many remembered the fire of Boudica, the storm of the north, the comrades buried under alien soil. The veterans would sit quietly sometimes, staring into their cups, listening to the wind outside the walls. The wind in Britain was never silent. It was always saying something, if only you could translate it. By 108 AD, the fortress was fully rebuilt in stone. Granaries with thick buttresses, vaulted roofs designed to keep grain dry through endless winters. The Principia, adorned with marble fragments, imported all the way from Italy. Statues of the emperors lined the main square, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. The men joked that no one could keep track of who was emperor this week. They were half right. And then came that inscription, their last trace in history. It was carved on a slab of limestone dedicated to the Emperor Trajan. It reads, in formal Latin, to the Emperor Caesar, Nerva Trajan, Augustus the Ninth, Legion Hispana. Dutiful and faithful built this. That single sentence is the final confirmed heartbeat of the Ninth. After that, the record falls silent. No more inscriptions, no more tiles, no more scribes scratching their name into wax. It's as if the pen snapped mid-sentence. Historians have debated it for centuries. Were they transferred, destroyed, disbanded? Some claim they were annihilated in Scotland, others that they were sent east to die in Parthia or Judea. The truth is, no one knows. But in that moment, the day that stone was set into the wall, the Ninth Hispana was still alive, still proud, still writing its name in the empire's story. And maybe that's why York feels different from other Roman cities. Walk through its narrow lanes at night, and you can almost hear them, the echo of hobnailed sandals, the clang of hammers from a long-vanished forge, the faint murmur of Latin under the sigh of the wind. Because Iberacum didn't die when the Ninth did. It remembered. It became Rome's memory in stone. A century later, other legions would garrison here, the 6th, the 20th, and emperors themselves would die within these walls. Constantine the Great would be proclaimed here. But the foundation, the bones, the shape of the city, all of it was laid by the Ninth. The legions' bodies are gone, their names erased, their records scattered. But the fortress remains. Eboracum was their immortality. And even if the empire forgot them, the stones never did. If you leaf through Rome's military archives, those endless tablets and scrolls, filled with figures and signatures, you'll notice something strange. Around the year 108 AD, the Legio Hispana, the Ninth Legion, faithful and valiant veterans of 100 years of campaigns, simply stops appearing. No warning, no disaster report, no decree disbanding them. One page, they're carving an inscription to Emperor Trajan in York. The next, nothing. It's a silence so deep it hums, for a civilization that prided itself on documentation. on never forgetting this kind of absence feels like a scream muffled under marble. Rome remembered everything: pay ledgers, troop movements, even the daily rations of donkey fodder. And yet somehow, it forgot 5,000 men. Historians have tried to explain it, of course. Some say the records were lost, that the archives simply didn't survive. Others suggest that the legion was reassigned, renamed, or merged into another unit, their identity erased by bureaucracy. But the silence around the ninth is peculiar, not the random erosion of time, but a deliberate blank space. It's as if someone somewhere decided not to look too closely. The last datable evidence, that proud inscription from York, feels almost like a farewell note carved in stone. After that, there's no mention of the ninth in Britain, no tile stamps, no new altars. The next legion known to occupy York is the 6th Victrix, arriving around 122 AD. In the official record, the exchange is polite routine even. The 6th arrives, the ninth is gone. No comment, no transition report, no explanation. For an empire obsessed with order, that's terrifying. Imagine the clerks in Rome's central archives, their fingers smudged with ink scanning the lists. Leg 8, Augusta, stationed in Gaul. Leg X, Gemina, in Spain. Leg Enam, Hispana. And then a blank. It's not just that the legion vanished. It's that the world didn't seem to notice. What does that kind of forgetting feel like? For a soldier, it would be unimaginable. Every man in the legion lived his life by the rhythm of the tabularium. The record room. Promotions, punishments, pay slips. Pensions all depended on being written down. A soldier without a record wasn't just dead. He'd never existed. But for the ninth, even their paperwork died. There's a certain poetic cruelty in it. This was the legion that had built Rhodes forts and whole cities. Their names stamped in clay, carved into walls, sung in victories from Gaul to Spain to the edge of the world. They had survived Boudicca's fire, rebuilt their honor, and conquered the north. And then silence. A bureaucratic vanishing act. To a modern reader, it might sound like clerical error. To a Roman, it was horror. The empire's identity was built on permanence, on the belief that the machine never faltered. If the ninth could vanish, what else might slip through the cracks? Somewhere in that silence, there's a human truth too. Not every disappearance comes with blood. Sometimes it's just neglect, the slow drowning of memory in the flood of newer events. Picture Eboracum, in the months after the ninth's final inscription. The fortress still stood, the walls still gleaming with fresh stone. The civilian settlement still bustled with traders and craftsmen. But the soldiers were different. New faces, new accents, new insignia. The 6th Victrix marched in their banners bright, their songs unfamiliar. The locals watched the procession, 5,000 fresh men filling the streets, and asked the question no one dared to write down. Where did the others go? Maybe a few old civilians still remembered the ninth. The man who sold them wine, the woman who mended their cloaks, the children who once chased their drills in the square. But in empire time, memory is short. Within a generation, the ninth became rumor. Archaeologists have spent centuries chasing that silence through the soil. They dig at York Lincoln and beyond the wall, looking for any trace, a mass grave, a camp lair, a fragment of inscription. They find pieces, yes, but never the whole. A broken sword here, a tile stamped Leg 9. Reused in a later building, a bit of chainmail in a ditch. Enough to whisper, not enough to speak. Some insist they must have met their end in battle, perhaps in Caledonia, wiped out by the same tribes they once crushed. Others think they were transferred to the Rhine frontier, or even to the east, where the Parthians swallowed armies whole. The theories multiply, like shadows at dusk. But the strangest thing isn't that we don't know how, they disappeared. It's that the empire didn't seem to care. Hadrian came to Britain a few years later. He was a different kind of emperor, pragmatic, cautious, allergic to unnecessary heroics. His first move was to build a wall, a physical line, to define what Rome could hold and what it couldn't. Some say that Hadrian's Wall was born out of fear, the fear that what happened to the ninth could happen again. The emperor's solution to mystery was architecture. If men could vanish, at least stone would remain. Perhaps then, the ninth's disappearance was not a tragedy, but a revelation. It taught Rome that conquest has limits, that there are places where roads crumble, where language fails, where even the best-led legions dissolve into the landscape, and yet even silence leaves fingerprints. You can still stand in York and trace their presence. The stones beneath the minster's crypt still bear the lines of the Roman fortress. The old Via Praetoria runs under modern streets. Somewhere under the pavement lies the barrack floor, where the last men of the ninth slept, perhaps unaware that history was about to erase them. If you walk those streets on a cold morning, the city feels layered medieval Victorian Roman time stacked like sediment. Beneath it all, a heartbeat persists. The ninth never really left. They're in the stones, in the walls, in the very plan of the city. Perhaps that's the closest thing to immortality any soldier ever gets. Not a name in marble, but the faint echo of footsteps underfoot 2,000 years later. Because when you lose the trail of the ninth Hispana in the record books, you begin to find them elsewhere, in the rhythm of roads, in the ghostly geometry of forts, in the quiet persistence of what they built. It's strange, isn't it? The empire that promised eternity couldn't remember 5,000 of its own men. And yet long after Rome's eagles have turned to dust, their silence has outlived the marble. When a story disappears, the imagination rushes to fill the vacuum. And so, it was with the ninth Hispana, 5,000 names swallowed by mist, and a mystery so perfect that every generation since has tried to write its own ending. History doesn't leave many gifts this poetic. No corpses, no battlefield, no survivors' letters, just a silence shaped exactly like a question. What happened to the Ninth Legion? Across the centuries, 3 great theories have battled for dominance, each with its believers, its evidence, and its poetry. None of them quite satisfy, but together they reveal more about Rome and about us than the truth ever could. The First Path, the Massacre in the North. The most cinematic version, the one favored by novelists and filmmakers alike, says that the Ninth marched north into Scotland, perhaps to reinforce a frontier fort, perhaps to crush a rebellion, and simply never returned. Imagine it, a long column of men winding through the valleys of Caledonia, their red cloaks dark with rain, their armor dulled by years of service. The wind carries the sound of their marching into the empty hills, and somewhere beyond, an enemy they cannot see is waiting. They'd been here before. The same ridges, the same pine forests dripping with fog. But something feels wrong this time. Too quiet, too empty. The scouts don't come back. Then from the mist, a horn. The Caledonians attack, not as one army, but as the land itself, from behind every rock, from every hollow from above. Spears rain down like cold hail. The Roman formation holds for a while, they always hold, but the ground turns to mud. The standards fall, and order dissolves into horror. No one escapes. No messenger reaches Iberacum. Only silence. When the next patrol ventures north weeks later, they find nothing. No bodies, no equipment, not even a campfire trace. Just a few broken shields, half buried in peat. For those who love tragic symmetry, it's perfect, the ninth ending, where they began lost in the same northern mists that once swallowed Varus's legions in Germany. The empire's great loop of pride and forgetting complete. and it fits a certain Roman pattern. The Teutoburg disaster had already shown what could happen when arrogance met landscape. The Caledonian highlands were just as treacherous, just as full of tribes who knew how to let nature fight for them. Yet the archaeological trail rebels against the poetry. Excavations north of Hadrian's Wall reveal raids, yes, and destroyed forts, but not enough to explain the vanishing of an entire legion. No mass graves, no concentrated layer of destruction from that era. The ground, stubbornly silent, refuses to cooperate with the legend. But myths have their own stubborn logic, and the vision of the ninth dying together in the fog, their eagle sinking into the marshes of Scotland, their last shouts echoing off the hills, is almost too beautiful to abandon. Two, the second path, the Long March East. The historian's alternative is less romantic, but perhaps more Roman. According to inscriptions and scattered papyri, a ninth legion may have later appeared or been confused with forces stationed in the Rhine provinces, even in the Eastern Empire. Under Emperor Trajan, the legions were stretched thin. Campaigns in Dacia and later Parthia devoured manpower. It's entirely possible some argue that the ninth was quietly transferred from Britain to the continent around 120 AD. They might have been redeployed to Nijmegen. In the Netherlands, there is an inscription there naming the ninth around that time. Or perhaps they went farther still, to Armenia or Cappadocia, to fight the Parthians, Rome's eternal nemesis in the east. The empire often renamed legions after heavy losses or reorganizations. A unit could vanish from one province's paperwork only to reappear elsewhere under a slightly altered name. Bureaucracy, not blood, could erase a legion just as effectively as battle. Picture it, the veterans of Britain packing up their gear, bidding farewell to the gray skies of York boarding ships bound for the Rhine. The fortress empties the walls. Echo the town's taverns, lose their best customers. Months later, the same soldiers are trudging through the deserts of the east, squinting under a sun that feels like punishment. Their bronze gleams again. Their sandals kick up dust instead of mud. Perhaps for a while the ninth lives on, under another emperor's banner, another number. And then another silence. The eastern campaigns were brutal. Whole legions vanished in Parthian wars, their records mangled in the chaos of retreat and plague. The fire that later consumed many of Rome's archives did the rest. It's possible, perhaps even probable, that the ninth didn't die in Britain at all, but thousands of miles away, fighting for an empire that no longer remembered who they were. It's less cinematic, yes, but there's a different kind of tragedy in it, the quiet anonymity of bureaucratic death. Not slaughtered in glory, but slowly erased by paperwork and dust. Three, the third path, the erasure of the ledger. And then there's the most haunting theory of all, that the ninth never perished at all, not in body, but in identity. Maybe they were disbanded, absorbed into newer formations when Hadrian reorganized the British army. The number 9 might have been retired after a scandal, a mutiny, or a political embarrassment now lost to time. Rome did this often. When a legion's loyalty came into question, its name could be struck out like a bad sentence. The soldiers reassigned the banners, burned the eagle quietly buried. Officially, it would be as if they'd never existed. Think about that. For an empire obsessed with the permanence of ink and stone deletion was the ultimate punishment. The disappearance of the ninth might not have been a battle at all, but a decision made in an office, written in a neat hand, by someone who never saw a battlefield. A bureaucrat, not a barbarian, may have killed them. It's almost funny in a bleak Roman way. The same machine that had once built the legion into legend eventually processed it out of existence. One day, a clerk in Rome's archives would have unrolled a scroll, seen the faint notation Legio Hispana, withdrawn from Britain, and simply not written it again. And just like that, they were gone. Each of these theories, massacre, transfer, erasure, tells its own story, not just about the ninth, but about the empire that lost them. If they died in the north, it means Rome was still capable of tragedy. If they were sent east, it means Rome was still capable of forgetting. If they were deleted, it means Rome had become too proud to admit weakness. In every version, though, there's one common thread: disappearance as destiny. The ninth, the legion that had lived through Caesar's ambition, Boudicca's rage, and Agricola's frozen victories, became the embodiment of empire's final truth, that even the most disciplined order will one day dissolve into silence. 2,000 years later, the fog hasn't lifted. If anything, it's thickened, not the kind that clings to the highlands, but the kind that forms in the gaps of knowledge. The ninth Hispana, the lost legion of Rome, has become a magnet for every shovel drone and dreamer who wants to rewrite history. From the first Victorian spade to the newest ground-penetrating radar, archaeologists have hunted the ninth like detectives chasing a ghost. They find footprints, faint, beautiful, misleading, but never the body. Every fragment becomes an argument, every silence a theory. It started in the 19th century, when the British Empire, drunk on its own reflection of Rome, rediscovered the mystery. Victorian scholars, their mustaches as thick as their patriotism, became obsessed with the idea that a Roman legion had vanished on British soil. To them, the ninth's disappearance was a parable even the greatest empire could bleed into myth. So they began to dig. They combed the length of Hadrian's Wall, the moors of Scotland, the valleys of the Tweed and Tay. Every fragment of tile stamped Legni Hispana was treated like a holy relic. York became a pilgrimage site for historians in top hats, notebooks trembling with excitement. One of the first clues came from a stone altar unearthed in the late 1800s, dedicated by the ninth to Emperor Trajan. Proof that they had existed, certainly, but no hint of what happened next. Another inscription appeared in the Netherlands at Nijmegen, dated a few years later. Did that mean they had moved? Or was it simply another ninth misread by hopeful eyes? The trail, instead of clearing, grew more tangled. For decades, the popular imagination insisted on one story, that the ninth had been annihilated in Scotland. It was too perfect to resist a whole legion marching into the mist, swallowed by the highlands, leaving only ghost stories and the faint smell of rain. Novelists loved it. Poets adored it. The Victorians made it their own mirror myth, Britain as the place that humbled even Rome. Then the 20th century arrived, and with it, new methods and colder skepticism. Archaeologists with brushes instead of sabers began to question the legend. No mass graves, no burned forts, no layer of ash dating to 120 AD that could mark a massacre. The soil that most honest of historians refused to corroborate. Somewhere under a Yorkshire meadow, a trench revealed a line of post holes, the remains of a wooden barracks. Coins scattered nearby bore the face of Trajan. A few military tiles carried the ninth stamp. And then above that layer, silence. The next occupation belonged to the 6th Legion. The stratigraphy was clear: one world ended, another began. But how remained a blank space between layers of dirt? Modern science sharpened the chase. Isotope analysis began to tell where soldiers were born and buried their bones, carrying signatures of the water they drank, the soil they ate from their food. But there were no bones to test. The ninth had left no cemetery, no battlefield ossuary, only fragments of life, a broken sword, a legionary brooch, a child's toy found near an old fort. In recent years, archaeologists have turned to drones, and LiDAR, scanning the moors for geometric anomalies, the faint fingerprints of Roman camps. Some finds have emerged temporary marching camps at Inchtuthil, Stracathro, and Drumquassel, all built to identical Roman specifications, but none show signs of final disaster. Each camp was dismantled neatly by order, as if the soldiers who built them had simply moved on. It's the neatness that's haunting. A lost legion should leave chaos behind, not perfect geometry. And yet, every now and then, something new surfaces enough to make hope flicker again. A few years ago, a cache of sling bullets was discovered near the fort at Vindolanda. Small, oval, deadly. Were they from a skirmish? A revolt? A last stand? Scholars argued over them, like priests debating prophecy. The site, layered with decades of Roman occupation, refuses to confess. Some theories now point far beyond Britain. In the east, in the dusty ruins of the Parthian frontier, a few inscriptions mention a Legio 9 fighting under Hadrian's reign. Others claim a detachment ended up in Judea, crushed during the Bar Kokhba revolt. The numbers don't quite fit, the dating is messy, but when evidence is this thin, hope becomes its own logic. And of course, there are always the dreamers. In the Scottish town of Stirling, a local legend insists that ghostly Roman soldiers still march across the Bannockburn field. At dusk, a river of pale figures gliding through the mist, their armor whispering instead of clanging. In Northumberland, farmers talk of strange alignments in their pastures lines of darker grass where the Romans once slept. Some swear that after heavy rain, coins rise from the mud like memories resurfacing. Science rolls its eyes at these stories, but even archaeologists, the most patient of detectives, admit that ghosts are sometimes useful. They keep people digging. There's an almost sacred irony in the search itself. The Romans had built their empire on record-keeping, every name cataloged, every brick inventoried. But now, their own precision betrays them. We notice the missing ninth, precisely because everything else is so well documented. It's not the loss of men that stings Rome, lost plenty, but the loss of certainty. Archaeology, in its quiet way, has become a kind of revenge on history. What ink forgot, earth remembers. But the earth is a poor storyteller. It whispers, never shouts. What has it whispered about the ninth? That they were here, that they built, that they vanished between one layer of soil and the next, and that somehow their disappearance mattered enough that we're still listening. Today, the search continues with satellites and algorithms instead of shovels. Artificial intelligence scans aerial photographs comparing vegetation patterns to ancient camp plans. Somewhere in those millions of pixels, maybe there's an unrecorded fort, the last camp of the ninth, its ditches still etched in the ground, invisible but not gone. Every generation renews the chase. Every discovery, no matter how small, becomes a love letter to the vanished. Because maybe the truth doesn't really matter anymore. Maybe the power of the ninth lies not in how they died, but in the fact that they could disappear at all, that 5,000 men could leave no more trace than a rumor. For archaeologists, that's the Holy Grail, the mystery that keeps the trowels moving. For the rest of us, it's a reminder that the past is not a locked box, but a mirror fogged by our own breath. When historians fall silent, storytellers rush in, and over the centuries, the ninth Hispana's silence became a stage, an empty amphitheater, where every generation projected its own fears and fantasies. The Romans had forgotten the ninth, but we never did. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, the empire's ruins dotted the British landscape like bones of a long-dead titan. Peasants plowed fields over Roman roads, monks carved abbeys out of Roman stones, and legends clung to the air like mist. People told stories of ancient soldiers who had vanished into the north, swallowed by curses, or storms their ghosts doomed to march forever. Even without proof, the idea of a lost legion refused to die. The notion that Rome, that perfect machine, could misplace something so monumental was irresistible. It made the empire human, fallible, mortal. The story slept for centuries, then woke again in the Victorian Age. Britain now, an empire itself, saw its own reflection in Rome's legacy. The roads, the order, the arrogance. When Victorian scholars rediscovered the ninth, it was like finding a mirror crack running through their own imperial confidence. They fell in love with the idea that even Rome had its breaking points. It was comforting in a grim way. If Rome could fall, so could Britain, and perhaps that fall could be noble, even beautiful. The missing legion became a parable wrapped in archaeology. Then came 1954, and one of the greatest gifts myth ever received, The Eagle of the Ninth, a historical novel by Rosemary Sutcliffe. Written for young readers, but beloved by everyone, it told the story of a Roman officer's quest to recover the lost eagle of the Ninth Legion from the wild north. The novel wasn't history, it was myth given flesh. And it worked so well that even professional historians started to question whether the fiction had slipped into fact. Sutcliffe's version was simple, cinematic, and deeply satisfying. The Ninth had been annihilated by northern tribes, their eagle captured, their memory erased. A century later, the protagonist rides into Scotland to retrieve it, and in doing so, redeems the fallen legion's honor. It was a story of redemption, of legacy, of empire trying to forgive itself. And it was so good that reality once again didn't stand a chance. For generations afterward, that image of the Ninth marching bravely into the mist, proud to the end, became the truth. School books, documentaries, even museum displays borrowed the legend. When the 2011 film The Eagle was released, complete with grim highland vistas and the usual muddy heroism, the myth became mainstream. And who could blame them? Reality never gives us such perfect endings. But beneath the poetry lies something more revealing about us than about them. The Ninth's legend keeps resurfacing because it offers the kind of story history rarely provides one with meaning. Empires, after all, are rarely granted dignified deaths. They rot, they bicker, they forget themselves. But the Ninth's disappearance feels cleaner, a sudden mysterious curtain fall. No corruption, no politics, no slow decay, just men marching into the fog, leaving us to wonder. That's what we crave an ending that still leaves room for imagination. Historians, meanwhile, have learned to tread carefully between myth and data. For every new discovery, a stone, a coin, a scrap of inscription, there's an echo of Sutcliffe's shadow standing behind it, reminding everyone that sometimes fiction digs deeper than archaeology. One modern scholar wrote, "The Ninth may never have vanished at all. What vanished was our ability to see it clearly." He meant it as a technical remark about missing documents, but it sounds almost spiritual. Every generation builds its own version of the Ninth, shaped by its own anxieties. For the Victorians, the Legion represented imperial hubris. For the Cold War, it was the fear of annihilation. For the modern world, it's the haunting of forgotten names, the price of progress, the memory of those crushed beneath systems too vast to care. When we tell the story of the lost Legion, we're also telling the story of lost people everywhere. Those who built, fought, worked, and vanished without record. The Roman legionary becomes a metaphor not for power, but for oblivion. That's why writers keep coming back to it. Hilary Mantel reimagined it. Historians redebated it. Novelists, filmmakers, and even video game designers resurrected it again and again. The Ninth became less a fact then a reflection, a mirror, that changes shape depending on who's looking into it. In the end, the line between scholarship and storytelling blurred completely. Museums began labeling their displays with careful phrases like "theories vary" and "possibly connected to the ninth." Archaeologists, exhausted by the eternal question, would half joke that if they ever found the Legion's bones, they'd bury them again just to keep the funding going. And maybe they're right to keep the mystery alive. Because in a way, the legend of the ninth is more valuable than the truth could ever be. The real Legion, those weary men stationed on the edge of empire, probably lived unromantic lives of mud and paperwork. They dug ditches, patched roads, argued with supply officers. Their disappearance, if it happened at all, was likely bureaucratic, not epic. But mystery turns those men into something larger, the embodiment of all human forgetting. They are every soldier lost without a name, every worker whose fingerprints still mark the stones of civilizations that no longer exist. That's the paradox. The ninth vanished from history, only to live forever in imagination. They achieved through absence the immortality Rome promised, but never delivered. And perhaps that's why we still chase them, not because we want to find them, but because we want to believe there's something left to find. At night, when the mists settle over Hadrian's Wall, the sheep bleeding somewhere in the dark, it's easy to imagine the shimmer of armor on the horizon. A line of soldiers, silent, marching toward the edge of the light. Not doomed, not lost, just forgotten by the empire they built. If you walk the ruins of a Roman fort, at dusk, any fort, anywhere, you can feel it a pulse beneath the stones. The ghosts of a system that believed in permanence. Straight roads, perfect walls, a logic that thought it could outlive weather. And yet every road ends somewhere. Every wall crumbles. The empire that built eternity also taught us how fragile memory really is. That, perhaps, is why the mystery of the ninth Hispana endures. It isn't just about what happened to them. It's about what happens to us when the record ends. We keep searching century after century because the disappearance of the ninth hits a nerve that goes beyond archaeology. It's not only the question, where did they go, but the whisper that follows it. How long before someone forgets me? The Romans were obsessed with immortality through record. Their version of eternal life wasn't heaven, but bureaucracy. To be written down was to exist forever. Every soldier's name inscribed on wax tablets, every road logged, every victory carved in stone. The fear of being unrecorded was greater than the fear of death. The ninth silence was therefore an existential scandal. It violated Rome's promise to itself. An empire that prided itself on total memory, on its ability to track even the nail supply at a provincial fort, had lost an entire heartbeat. The disappearance didn't just wound the map, it wounded the myth of control. And yet there's something hauntingly modern in that failure. In a way, the ninth didn't vanish. Despite the system, they vanished because of it. Too many scrolls, too many records, too many reforms. A change in a file here, a lost report there, and the human beings became statistics erased by an empire's own weight. Sound familiar? It's the same quiet disappearance that happens today, when names are deleted from databases, when workers are replaced by numbers, when human effort drowns under information overflow. The ninth story is the ancient version of the modern anxiety that our lives are just entries in someone else's ledger, one fire or one oversight away from deletion. That's why the question refuses to die. We look for the ninth in the soil, not only because we want to solve a riddle, but because we're terrified of the same fate of being lost in plain sight. Archaeologists are digging for more than helmets and swords. They're digging for reassurance that we last longer than the systems we build. History, after all, is not kind to individuals. Most of the human race has already disappeared nameless. Civilizations remember kings, not cooks, emperors, not engineers. Yet when a legion vanishes, the story changes scale. 5,000 men, not nameless peasants, but trained, recorded, disciplined, evaporating from the greatest administrative power in the ancient world that breaks the illusion. It tells us that no one is too large to vanish. And so we search. Because to solve the ninth's fate would be to tame the chaos, to prove that history still has a map. But what if the not knowing is the point? Maybe what captivates us isn't the answer, but the absence. The ninth's mystery has survived precisely because it remains unsolved. It invites every generation to project itself into the gap, to test the boundaries of what history can hold. For the Victorians, it was about imperial humility. For the Cold War, about survival and erasure. For us in the age of data and digital memory, it's about noise, about how even in a world that remembers everything, we can still feel forgotten. The ninth has become a symbol of that strange, comforting paradox that disappearance can create immortality. Had they left behind a simple record transferred to the Rhine, disbanded in Cappadocia, their story would have ended there, footnoted and forgotten. Instead, they vanished into eternity, the same way people do when the world stops recording them. In a sense, the Legion achieved what every Roman secretly wanted to outlive Rome. Their story endures long after the Senate, the emperors, and the empire itself turned to dust. Not through victory, not through monuments, but through absence. There's a line from a medieval chronicle, written centuries later, that says, "The Romans came to the edge of the world, and there they disappeared." No date, no details. Just that. It reads less like history and more like prophecy. Because in truth, all empires end exactly like that, reaching too far into the fog, confident that the map will hold, and then nothing. We like to believe the world is knowable, that every mystery can be solved with enough data. But the ninth silence is a reminder that mystery itself is part of what keeps us human. If history were complete, it would be unbearable, a library with no doors, a story with no imagination left to enter. The Lost Legion gives us permission to wonder. And maybe that's why their story fits so perfectly in this modern age of endless documentation and short memory. We have cameras that never sleep, archives that never close, feeds that never stop, and yet our sense of permanence has never felt more fragile. The ninth is our mirror proof that even the best systems of memory can fail. But if we can't find their bones, we can still find their echo, not in museums or trenches, but in ourselves. In every moment, we fight to be remembered. In every photograph, saved, every name carved into a headstone, every digital trace we leave like breadcrumbs against forgetting. The ninth were men, not myths, men who marched, cursed, bled, and likely died, believing Rome would remember them forever. And perhaps in a cosmic twist, Rome did, just not the way they imagined. Not in stone, but in story. Their silence became the empire's longest sentence. And if you listen closely to the wind curling over the moors, to the hum of an archaeological drone, to the pages of books still being written about them, you can almost hear it, the faint rhythm of their marching. 5,000 heartbeats still echoing after 2 millennia. That's why we still search. Not to close the case, but to keep it open, to keep them walking, step by step, through time. It rains almost every day in the north of England. The kind of rain that doesn't fall exactly. It lingers, floating like memory. And if you stand on the old Roman road that cuts through the moors outside York, you can still hear it, the soft rhythm of drops striking ancient stone a pulse steady and eternal. People say that when the light is low and the mist rolls in from the ooze, the air hums faintly, not like thunder or wind, but like something marching far away. A line of footsteps, too precise to be natural. The locals smile when you ask. That's just the ninth, they say. Still heading north. It's an old joke, a ghost story told to tourists. But it contains the one truth that has outlasted every excavation, every theory, every empire that came after. The ninth Hispana never really left Britain. They just changed forms, turned from soldiers into sound, from names into whispers, because every story leaves a trail. Archaeologists may search for the evidence, but what they're really chasing is presence, the proof that someone once stood here with purpose. The Roman roads, those unyielding veins of stone, still cross the landscape like the arteries of a sleeping giant. Some have become highways. Others lie buried under farms. But if you strip the asphalt away, the bones of the empire are still there. And the ninth built many of them. That's the strangest part of their legend. They vanished from history, yet their fingerprints remain everywhere. Every mile marker, every carved stone in York's foundations, every tile stamped Leg 9, Hispana. These are the small, stubborn proofs that the lost legion never truly disappeared. They're here, just beneath the surface. York, the city they raised, still carries their ghost in its geometry. The old Roman street grid survived the Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans. The heart of Eboracum beats under coffee shops and cobblestones. The Principia, their old headquarters, sits beneath York Minster's foundations, the cathedral of another empire built on the bones of the first. If you descend into the crypt today, the air grows cooler, damp with centuries. There, under the church's stones, you can still see fragments of Roman masonry, arches, and walls from the fortress that the ninth built almost 2,000 years ago. Tour guides point them out to visitors, their flashlights trembling slightly as they speak. But it's not the stones that matter. It's the silence between them, the way history echoes in the pauses. Because the real story of the ninth Hispana isn't carved in marble or sealed in archives. It lives in the strange persistence of absence, the way their vanishing keeps circling back like a heartbeat you can't unhear. Every empire thinks it's eternal. Rome certainly did. It believed in laws carved into bronze and architecture that could resist time and armies that could stamp order onto chaos. But the ninth reminds us that even the strongest structures depend on memory, and memory by nature leaks. The Romans built with stone. We build with data. Both crumble the same way, not in one dramatic collapse, but grain by grain, click by click, until all that's left is the outline of something once magnificent. That's why the ninth lingers in our imagination. They embody the moment when the illusion cracked, when the most organized civilization on Earth proved it could forget itself. And that's a lesson that keeps repeating. Every age has its ninth legion. A vanished explorer, a lost ship, a city swallowed by desert sand. We search for them not just to recover the past, but to remind ourselves that erasure is possible. That one day, our own monuments will be ruins, our own records, indecipherable, our own names, half-remembered whispers on some archaeologist's tongue. And yet, the persistence of our search proves the opposite, that remembering is just as stubborn. Maybe that's what the ghosts of the ninth are really teaching us, that even the forgotten can become unforgettable if their story makes people care enough to keep asking. It's not hard to imagine them here still. Picture it, a line of soldiers' faces, weathered and unreadable, trudging along the Roman road under gray skies. Their armor dull, their breath fogging in the cold. They march through centuries, unseen but never gone. Past Saxon kings, Viking raids, medieval cathedrals, and electric streetlights. The world keeps changing around them, but their formation never breaks. One man in the line glances upward as he walks squinting at the unfamiliar skyline, glass towers glinting beyond the horizon. He doesn't understand them, but he doesn't need to. The rhythm keeps him moving, step, step, step. The empire, in whatever form it takes, still expects him to march. He does. They all do. We keep them alive by imagining them that way, disciplined, eternal lost, but unyielding, because we need them to be. The story of the ninth is how we practice remembering. It's the sound of our collective fear that someday we might vanish from the record, and the quiet hope that someone someday will still be listening for our footsteps. Every so often, an archaeologist will announce a new discovery, a piece of armor here, a camp boundary there. The headlines flare up for a week, have we found the lost legion? Then inevitably, the evidence fizzles. But that's fine. The search itself is the monument. And perhaps that's the only monument the ninth ever wanted. Because what is eternity really? A statue crumbles. A name on parchment fades. But a mystery, a mystery endures. It travels. It adapts. It finds new believers. The ninth Hispana has lived in scrolls and novels, in classrooms, in films, in quiet whispers on moors. They've survived in the mouths of those who don't even realize they're repeating an ancient name. And in doing so, they've become something greater than a legion. They've become a question that history can't close. That's immortality. So if you ever find yourself in York on a rainy evening, take a detour. Walk the old Roman wall that still circles part of the city. The stones under your feet are older than most countries. The wind that moves through the cracks is the same wind the ninth breathed. When you stop, listen. You might hear it too faint, rhythmic, steady. Step, step, step. It's not thunder, not traffic, just 5,000 men who refuse to stop marching. And maybe that's the true ending. Not a massacre, not a mutiny, not even erasure. Just movement forward, always forward into history's infinite reign. Because some legions die, and others simply keep walking. Centuries fade the way sand drifts over footprints. One storm, one war, one translation, and the ground changes shape. By the time the Middle Ages rose on the ashes of Rome, Britain had forgotten the ninth Hispana, not as an act of cruelty, but of exhaustion. The empire had retreated. The legions had gone home, or so everyone thought, and in their absence, new kingdoms took root in the shell of what was left. But the land remembered. Roman roads still cut through forests the Saxons called haunted. Their straightness felt unnatural alien. Travelers swore they heard the clink of armor on nights with no moon. In Yorkshire, shepherds whispered that under certain stones, the earth rang hollow, as if a legion still slept beneath it, waiting for a trumpet that would never sound. Archaeology hadn't been invented yet, but superstition does the same work. It preserves the feeling of presence long after facts dissolve. To those early farmers and monks, the ruins around them were not Roman. They were giant-built, devil-built, or ghost-built. The empire became myth. Its soldiers folded into the same half-world as elves and saints. Even in forgetting, the ninth endured not in record, but in atmosphere. The centuries rolled forward. The Vikings came, then the Normans, each layering their own roads and churches atop the old Roman bones. York became Eoforwic, then Jorvik, then York again. Empires rename, but they never truly erase. Beneath every new stone, another waits. When medieval stonemasons dug foundations for cathedrals, they often found carved altars and reused them. Some of those altars still bear the faint inscriptions of the ninth Legni Hispana. The masons didn't understand the Latin, but they recognized power when they saw it. To build on a Roman stone was to borrow its strength. And so without realizing it, they became the ninth's final architects, sealing their memory into Gothic walls, their ghosts into cathedrals. The Middle Ages gave the Lost Legion its first resurrection, not as soldiers, but as legend. Chroniclers told of armies that marched out to sea and never returned, of spirits guarding buried treasure, of strange Roman coins that cursed whoever dug them up. One Welsh tale spoke of Y Milwircolion, the lost soldiers, who march beneath the ground in endless circles, keeping time until the world ends. They are neither alive nor dead. They are history itself repeating. Centuries later, English poets would rediscover these tales and recognize their echo, the Ninth Legion, hiding under the folk memory like roots beneath moss. The story was too good to vanish. It adapted to every tongue. And when Britain began to think of itself as an empire again, the old ghosts stirred. The Victorians loved ruins almost as much as they loved moral lessons. To them, Rome was both warning and inspiration, the grand civilization that fell because it forgot its virtues. When scholars rediscovered the inscription in York and realized a whole legion had disappeared, it felt like divine poetry. Even Rome, they murmured, could lose its way. The ninth became a moral parable for the age of railroads and colonies. Painters imagined red-coated Romans trudging through Highland fog, their eagle glinting dimly in the gloom. Writers filled the gaps with courage and tragedy. The Victorians turned history into sermon. The empire that forgets its dead will join them. Yet even as they wept for the Romans, they were repeating them, building railways across deserts, rewriting other people's maps, convinced that their own paperwork would last forever. Perhaps that's why the Ninth's mystery resonated so deeply. It was the shadow under their confidence. As the 20th century dawned, the story changed again. The Lost Legion became a symbol not of empire's virtue, but of its vulnerability. World War I scarred the land and imagination alike. Suddenly, entire regiments could vanish in a single morning, swallowed by artillery and mud. The Ninth's legend, once distant and romantic, now felt prophetic. Historians revisited it with a new empathy. 5,000 men disciplined, brave gone, without a trace. It no longer sounded mythical. It sounded familiar. And in the aftermath of World War II, when the ruins of London smoked like a modern Pompeii, the story of the Ninth turned almost comforting. Here was proof that disappearance didn't mean extinction, that even a lost army could echo across millennia. Then in 1954, Rosemary Sutcliffe wrote The Eagle of the Ninth and gave the silence a heartbeat again. Her hero's quest to reclaim the lost standard, the Golden Eagle of the Ninth, was not just about Rome. It was about healing identity belonging. The book struck like lightning. For post-war Britain, trying to make sense of loss and legacy, it was the perfect parable, an empire's ghost seeking redemption. And yet under all the retellings, one thing remains constant: the Ninth never speaks. They exist only through others, the diggers, the dreamers, the storytellers. Every new version of the tale adds a layer to the silence, polishing it like a stone. But silence can be a form of immortality. Because the more time passes, the clearer the paradox becomes. If the Ninth had been found, if archaeologists unearthed their graves, tomorrow the mystery would die, and with it, their mythic power. What began as loss has become a form of resurrection. We don't need their bones. We already have their story, and it's stronger than stone. The Romans built to last, but time taught them a cruel lesson. Permanence isn't about endurance. It's about remembrance. The bricks of Eboracum have crumbled. The paperwork turned to dust. But the imagination, that fragile, flickering human faculty, has carried the Ninth farther than any march ever could. So the ghosts of the Lost Legion continue to walk. Through novels, through classrooms, through the drizzle on a Yorkshire morning, through every person who pauses at the foot of an old Roman wall and feels that electric shiver of connection that small. There's a road outside York that used to lead north, straight as a thrown spear. The locals call it the Roman Road, though it has been patched, paved, renamed, and forgotten more times than anyone can count. Sheep graze along its shoulders now. The air smells of wet grass and cold stone. But if you walk it in silence, no phone, no map, no sound, but your own steps, you start to feel something underfoot. It's not superstition. It's memory. The kind that hums beneath the soles. Because this is where they marched the men of the 9th Hispana, the soldiers who built the world's edges out of geometry and sweat. Once upon a time, they filled this road with their sound, the clatter of sandals on stone, the steady rhythm of discipline. Now, the rhythm belongs to the rain. Every story has to end somewhere, even the ones that pretend not to. And maybe that's the lesson the 9th left us. Not all endings look like they should. Some happen quietly, without trumpets or tombstones. A name erased from a roster, a legion that simply stops existing in ink. But endings are just beginnings seen from the wrong side. So imagine it with me, their final march. The day begins the same as any other. Dawn spreads like pale fire over the fortress at Iberacum. The standard bearer raises the eagle, its golden wings, catching the light for the 1000th time. Orders are read, rations, divided ranks assembled. A column of 5,000 men farmers' sons from Italy, Gaul, and Hispania tighten their belts and shoulder their shields. They've marched this way 100 times before. South to London, north to the frontier, east toward the coast. But this morning, they head north again, beyond the known, into fog that clings to the hills like breath. There are no songs, just the quiet determination of men who've spent their lives making order from uncertainty. Maybe they were answering a call, a rebellion, a raid, a governor's whim. Maybe they were simply rotating garrisons, the endless shuffle of empire's chessboard. No one writes down those details, not when the machine is still turning. The first miles are easy. The road stretches smooth and sure. The fort disappears behind them. The moors open ahead. They cross rivers, eat dry bread, adjust their pace. A century later, a monk will walk the same route and call it the Road of Spirits. By midday, clouds roll in. The hills narrow. The wind begins to howl, a high keening sound that makes speech pointless. The air smells of pine and peat. The road grows slick. In some versions of the story, this is where it happens. The first arrow comes from the ridge. It's followed by another, then another. The formation halts. Shields lock. From the fog, shapes appear, hundreds, then thousands. Warriors half naked and painted, roaring the names of forgotten gods. The Roman line holds, always. They fight as they've trained, step thrust, cover, repeat. Order against chaos, discipline against fury. For a while it works. The front line absorbs the charge, the pila fly, the enemy falls. But there are too many, and the hills too steep. The fog thickens, the ground turns to mud, and the 9th begins to fracture, not from fear, but from isolation. A cohort here, a maniple there, each fighting its own private war in the mist. The eagle glimmers through, the smoke vanishes, reappears, then vanishes again. Maybe they fought for hours, maybe for days. Maybe there was no battle at all, just a storm. A crossing gone wrong, a disappearance so mundane, it became myth by default. A river flood, a plague, a political cover-up, bureaucratic amnesia dressed up as tragedy. But myth has its own precision. When the fog finally lifts, the hillside is quiet. The grass glistens with dew. The ravens gather. The wind carries no names, and the 9th Hispana is gone. No survivors limp back to camp. No messenger reports to the governor. The fortress waits for weeks, then months, then years. Eventually, a new legion takes its place. The paperwork moves on. In Rome, a clerk dips his stylus into ink, hesitates, and writes another line Legio 9 Hispana removed from rolls. Just like that, 5,000 lives become a blank space. But maybe not entirely, because the land doesn't forget as easily as ink does. The roads they paved still hold the shape of their march. The forts they built still trace their geometry in the grass. Every stone they set carries their fingerprints too small to see, but too stubborn to erase. Maybe that's why their ghost lingers. Not in horror, but in repetition. The land remembers the sound of their footsteps and keeps echoing it every time wind rushes across the moors, every time rain falls steady on the Roman stones. When you walk those roads now, you walk with them. You don't need to believe in ghosts to feel it. The world has a memory for rhythm. And sometimes, I think that's what immortality really means. Not statues or records or the illusion of empire, but the simple persistence of motion, the fact that something once moved here, and the world hasn't forgotten how it sounded. If they died marching. If they vanished as they lived in formation together, their discipline outlasting even their names. The Romans believed that a man's soul followed his genius, his purpose into eternity. The ninth's genius was order, to march, to build, to endure. Perhaps that's why their story endures too, because they're still marching not through time, but through imagination, through the hands of archaeologists brushing away dirt, through the pens of writers sketching their outline, through the breath of anyone whispering whatever happened to them. Some mysteries are graves, others are mirrors. The ninth is both. When we look into their fog, we see the shape of our own endings, the fear of being forgotten, and the hope that our work might outlast our names. So yes, they vanished. But they also survived in stone, in story, in sound. Because the world remembers movement, and the ninth never stopped moving. Somewhere in the endless rain of northern Britain, under the gray light that makes the land glow like old bronze, 5,000 ghosts keep their line. Their shields glint like water. Their breath fogs the air. Their eagle gleams just once before dissolving into mist. Rome didn't fall in a day. It faded like ink left too long in sunlight. Its walls still stood for centuries. Its coins still glittered. Its laws still shaped entire kingdoms. But the heartbeat that built it, the legions began to scatter. The ninth Hispana was only the first whisper of that coming silence. Every civilization believes it will remember itself. It builds monuments, laws, archives, ways to outlast time. Rome was better at it than anyone. And yet, when you look closely, even its memory is full of blank spaces. Names missing, battles unnamed, cities whose ruins survive, but whose purpose no one recalls. The ninth was not the last thing Rome lost. They were simply the first proof that forgetting could happen. By the 3rd century, the legions themselves had changed. They were smaller now, more local, less Roman in blood, but still Roman in habit. The empire stretched thin across a world it could no longer understand. Britain became a burden, too far, too cold, too costly to maintain. Emperors came and went like the tides. Soldiers swore allegiance to men they would soon betray. The old certainty, the rhythm of marching and building, shattered into improvisation. The world was fragmenting, and Rome was still writing reports as it crumbled. And in that growing noise, the story of the ninth began to sound like prophecy. Imagine an officer in the 4th century staring at a half-empty roster, seeing a familiar number, Legio 9 Hispana. He hesitates, unsure if the name is real or a ghost from an old ledger. He crosses it out just in case. That small act, the erasure of a line, becomes symbolic of the empire itself. For every lost legion, there would be a lost law, a lost city, a lost god. Rome, that great catalog of order, was slowly turning into a blank page. The ruins would remain. They always do. When the last Roman governors left Britain around 410 AD, they sailed from ports the Ninth had once patrolled. Their ships vanished over the gray horizon, leaving behind roads, villas, baths, and walls, all still standing, all suddenly irrelevant. The locals moved into the empty forts, repurposed the stone, forgot the Latin words for what they were. Somewhere, under a collapsed roof, the ghosts of the Ninth watched the world start over. It didn't take long for memory to rewrite them. By the time medieval monks began chronicling the island's history, Rome had already become legend. The Ninth were no longer soldiers. They were shadows in shining armor, phantoms guarding hidden treasure or warnings of pride. The miraculum of the lost legion turned into moral lesson. Even the mighty can vanish. It was as though their silence had expanded, swallowing the centuries after them. And maybe that's what every empire does. In the end, it forgets not only its dead, but its reasons. It keeps building until it can no longer recall why. When Hadrian built his famous wall, he must have understood this on some level. He didn't build it for glory. He built it for boundaries, to make the infinite finally stop. Perhaps the Ninth's disappearance had taught him that expansion was just another way of losing oneself. Better to draw a line, declare it sacred, and guard it forever. But nothing is guarded forever. Even Hadrian's wall fell quiet. Its forts turned into sheep pens, its watchtowers into piles of stone. Centuries later, farmers scavenged it for building material. What was once the northern edge of the world became just another field. And yet, beneath that field, the stones still fit together perfectly. You can trace the alignment with your hand. You can feel the Roman mind at work in every angle. Even in ruins, order lingers. Perhaps that's why the Ninth story feels more alive now than it did when they marched, because their loss gave us a kind of honesty about history, a reminder that even the best-built walls can't hold back oblivion. Modern historians try to reconstruct Rome from fragments. A potsherd here, a coin there, a name scratched on an amphora. But the more they discover, the more they realize how much is gone. For every triumph, there are a dozen unrecorded defeats. For every Caesar, 100 anonymous soldiers who paved the roads, raised the towers, fought and fell without inscription. The Ninth stands for all of them. We remember them precisely because they disappeared. In their silence, they speak for the countless others who were erased without even that much. Maybe that's why the story resonates so deeply in our time. The digital age has turned memory into something fragile again. Every click, every file, every photograph, so much recorded, so little retained. The cloud is our new empire, vast and confident, yet one power outage away from amnesia. We, too, build our monuments in data, not stone. And like the Romans, we believe we're safe because we've written everything down. But the Ninth whispers from the past writing is not remembering. Their disappearance isn't just a mystery to solve. It's a mirror held up to the way we lose things. Empires data selves. We vanish in subtler ways now. Yet even that vanishing creates beauty. Because the moment something is lost, the imagination moves in to rescue it. That's the strange gift of the Ninth Hispana. They prove that forgetting and remembering are partners, not enemies. One feeds the other. Every time someone asks what happened to them, they live again. Somewhere out on the moors, the light fades early. The rain comes sideways, and the horizon disappears. A traveler on the road pauses listening. The world is quiet except for the wind. And in that silence, there's an illusion, a heartbeat just beneath the weather, the faint rhythm of sandals on stone. It's not history anymore. It's something deeper. The land's own muscle memory. In a way, the empire didn't fall. It just spread itself so wide that it became invisible, dissolving into the very landscape it once ruled. The roads, the cities, the language, the laws, they all survive, scattered like seeds. The world we live in is the afterlife of Rome, and the ninth Hispana, forgotten on paper, but immortal in myth, became its conscience. A reminder whispered, through centuries of conquest, be careful. The map always ends somewhere. The Romans had a word for disappearance that didn't mean death damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It was punishment by forgetting. To be struck from the record, to have your name chipped from monuments, erased from scrolls, burned from every surface that might remember you. The worst fate a Roman could imagine wasn't dying. It was vanishing, as though you'd never lived. But history is mischievous. Sometimes the erased survive longer than the remembered. The emperors who ordered their enemies forgotten, Domitian, Commodus, Nero, they live on mostly as villains. But the ninth Hispana, wiped from the rolls, by accident or design, have endured as legend. The condemned memory became immortal precisely because it was lost. Maybe that's why their story won't die. It isn't just the mystery of where they went, but the deeper fear of why. Was it a battle? A betrayal? A clerical error? Or was it something more, human neglect? The empire simply stopped caring. Every civilization produces its ninth legion, eventually people who vanish, not in violence, but in indifference. Workers whose names are never recorded. Builders of cities whose fingerprints remain, but whose stories dissolve. The ninth is every forgotten laborer, every silenced name on the edge of empire. When you stand in the museums of York or London and stare at a tile stamped Legni Hispana, you can feel that tension humming through time. The stamp is mechanical, mass-produced official Roman, but the thumbprint pressed faintly in the clay beside it is personal. A single man, nameless, pressing his hand into the material world, as if to say, I was here. That tiny print may be the closest thing we have to their survival. Not a battle, not an inscription, but a human touch that slipped past oblivion. Names have weight. They tether us to the world. The ninth carried theirs for over a century, Hispana their title of origin, a reminder of their earliest victories in Spain. For generations that name meant something: courage, endurance, pride. When it vanished from the ledgers, it was like cutting a rope and watching a ship drift away from shore. And yet that drift made them free to become whatever we needed them to be. Sometimes they're heroes marching nobly into death. Sometimes they're victims of politics, pawns erased by empire. Sometimes they're ghosts. Sometimes they're symbols of how even the mighty can be swallowed by the quiet. The ninth Hispana have lived 1,000 afterlives in imagination. And maybe that's fitting, because they were never a single thing. A legion wasn't one body. It was a moving organism made of thousands of lives. Think of the variety that existed under that one bannerman from Spain, Gaul, Illyria, Thrace. Soldiers who spoke in accents that barely understood one another. Standard bearers who guarded the eagle like a lover. Camp followers, women traders, children who lived in the shadow of the fortress and disappeared alongside it when the orders came to march. If you close your eyes and listen closely, you can almost hear them breathing again, the sound of chatter in 20 dialects, the smell of iron and bread, the faint clang of tools in a fog-soaked morning. They were real, ordinary, and it is the ordinariness that makes them extraordinary now. Because the truth is, most of history is made by people whose names didn't survive it. The Roman chroniclers wrote about emperors and generals, not the legions who built the world. Tacitus And Suetonius gave us the poetry of conquest, but not the texture, the dirt under fingernails, the laughter in the barracks, the private oaths whispered to foreign gods before battle. The ninth were the empire's muscle and its heartbeat, and yet they were meant to be invisible background noise to Rome's brilliance, until suddenly they were gone. And in that silence, they became visible at last. It's strange to think that the men who lived to avoid individuality, who wore identical armor, marched in identical ranks, and died in anonymous graves, became immortal because of their collective disappearance. The loss of one name means grief. The loss of 5,000 means legend. We remember them now, not as individuals, but as a single pulse, the idea of 5,000 men, moving as one, then dissolving into fog. In their anonymity, they became universal. Walk through York today, and you'll see their shadow everywhere. The street names trace their camp's old boundaries. The curve of the river still follows their fortress wall. Even the tourists who photographed the ruins unknowingly retrace their footsteps. The ninth has become part of the city's DNA, not a ghost haunting it, but a foundation holding it up. And maybe that's the real afterlife, not being remembered as names, but as patterns. You can still see those patterns in how we build. Every time a city rises with clean lines and planned streets, it's a Roman inheritance. Every bureaucratic form, every numbered file, every border drawn with a ruler, that's the empire still echoing. We live inside Rome's paperwork, and the ninth Hispana are the fine print, the line where the ink faded. Sometimes I think they're lucky to have escaped before the fall, before the slow rot of empire turned glory to parody, before the marble cracked and the eagles tarnished. They slipped into myth at their peak, preserved forever as the Rome that still believed in itself. But then again, maybe there's something mournful about that too, to be remembered only for how you disappeared. It's easy to romanticize them, the soldiers in the mist, the noble last stand. Harder to accept the quieter possibility that they died like all armies, do not in poetry, but in bureaucracy. Their names reallocated their history, dissolved by neglect. Yet even that version is oddly comforting, because it means they didn't fail. They simply fulfilled their purpose, and then were absorbed back into the vast faceless machinery of time. We'll never find their graves. Not all mysteries are meant to end in discovery. Some are meant to linger, to remind us that memory itself is fragile, that for every line of history we preserve, 1,000 others have already vanished. And that maybe, in the end, there's no such thing as damnatio memoriae. Not really. Forgetting is temporary. The lost always surface again in a broken tile, in a legend, in a dream. The ninth's punishment became their salvation. Their name, once struck out, now glows brighter for it. It has weight again, heavier than any empire. And when the rain falls softly over York's old stones, it feels almost like an apology from the world itself. We remember now. Part 25. The Silence That Remains. By now we've followed the ninth Hispana across 2 millennia through archives, ruins, stories, and silence. They've been bones and breath soldiers, and symbols, history, and myth. And yet the closer we look, the further they recede. That's the paradox of the ninth. They exist most vividly in absence. Every attempt to capture them, every excavation, every theory, every novel only reminds us of what can never be known. The more we search, the clearer it becomes that their greatest legacy is not their presence, but their echo. Still, there's a human instinct that won't rest. We want resolution. We crave a body, a battlefield, a final line. We want someone to dig up a sword in the moors to announce on the evening news that the ninth has finally been found. We want closure, but history rarely gives it. Instead, it offers fragments: a coin, here, a wall, there a whisper of a name, And when the evidence runs out, we build bridges of imagination to cross the gaps. The ninth stands on that bridge, balanced between archaeology and poetry. Maybe that's why they've survived longer than the empire that made them. Because Rome, for all its monuments and maps, is gone. But the question, what happened to them, is still alive. Every time someone asks it, the march begins again. There's something deeply human in that repetition. It's the same impulse that makes us trace old photographs, rebuild family trees, and visit cemeteries. The desire not just to know the past, but to be known by it, to be seen by the dead, even as we see them. If the ninth had never vanished, they would have been ordinary, just another legion, their deeds recorded in neat bureaucratic Latin, stationed at Iberacum, later transferred to Cappadocia, disbanded under Hadrian, and that would have been that. No novels, no legends, no whispers on the moors. Their disappearance turned them from history into story, from soldiers into myth. And stories, unlike empires, don't crumble, they transform. They evolve with every telling. They survive by being retold, misremembered, and reimagined. In the end, perhaps this is the ninth's final victory to outlive their empire by becoming something Rome never intended: poetry. If you walk the ruins of Hadrian's Wall at dusk, you can feel the layers of time pressing together. The grass hides the stone foundations. The stone hides the dirt of older roads, and beneath it all lie the ghosts of footsteps. The wind moves differently there. It doesn't whistle, it breathes. Somewhere along those hills, the ninth once stood watch. The horizon then was the same as it is now, endless gray, uncertain. Maybe they laughed at the weather. Maybe they sang songs in accents so thick their comrades didn't understand. Maybe they whispered to the gods of home, to Jupiter, to the local spirits, to the silence itself. They couldn't know they were about to become eternal. Or maybe they did. Maybe every soldier feels it, that strange premonition of vanishing, the sense that all the drilling and marching and building are really just ways to leave footprints deep enough to last. The Romans built for eternity. The ninth's eternity just happened to take a different shape. There's an inscription on a tomb in North Africa that reads, "We built walls that outlived us. The walls in return remember." That's the relationship between the ninth and the world they made. The walls remember. Every time archaeologists scrape away a layer of soil and find a Roman fort aligned perfectly to the compass, they're touching the edge of that memory. The geometry of empire. The discipline that defined a people who thought they could measure the infinite. The ninth's disappearance didn't erase that geometry, it simply scattered it. The world inherited their order, their logic, their restlessness. Even now, the world hums with their ghost. The GPS lines that trace highways across continents follow the same philosophy as Roman roads: straight, efficient conquering. Bureaucracy, architecture, administration, all descendants of the same imperial instinct. In a way, the entire modern world is the echo of their footsteps. We are their empire's afterlife. But let's come back to that sound, the one that never fades. The steady beat of marching, the rhythm of purpose. When the wind picks up across the moors and the heather bends like a sea, you can still imagine them there. The gray light turning their armor dull, their red cloaks snapping against the rain. Faces smeared with mud and time. They aren't ghosts of fear, they're ghosts of work, of duty, of endurance. There's no tragedy in that image, only inevitability. Because the ninth story isn't about loss anymore. It's about persistence, the quiet kind that doesn't ask for monuments, only memory. They remind us that history is not a graveyard, but a living field. The past is not gone. It's beneath our feet, growing upward through everything we build. When you walk on an old Roman road, you're walking on their labor. When you read their name, you're continuing their story. When you wonder where they went, you're keeping them alive. That's the miracle of it. The ninth isn't lost. They're simply diffused, spread across time, across imagination, across every human attempt to understand what it means to disappear. So maybe this is where we leave them, not in defeat, not even in mystery, but in motion. 5,000 men, still marching north through a rain that never ends. Their eagle gleams for an instant in a flash of lightning. The sound of their sandals fades into the distance. The road goes on. Somewhere ahead lies the border between history and legend, and they cross it without hesitation. They always did. Because the ninth Hispana, whether alive, dead, or reborn in memory, never stopped doing what they were made to do, moving forward into the unknown. And perhaps that's all any of us ever do. We march into the fog, carrying our small banners of purpose, hoping that someone somewhere will remember that we passed this way. If they listen closely enough, maybe they'll hear us too, our footsteps mingling with theirs, our questions merging with their silence. The lost legion doesn't need to be found anymore. It already found us. And when the rain starts to fall again, soft and unending, it's not mourning them. It's applause.